The room is hot, even after sunset. Outside, Babylon breathes like a living furnace, its canals holding the day's warmth, its mud brick walls glowing faintly in the last bronze light, its courtyards smelling of dust, river water, incense, sweat, and wine. Somewhere beyond the palace, the Euphrates moves in darkness, slow and patient, as it has moved past kings far older than the man now lying inside the royal chamber. Servants move quietly. Physicians wait with the helpless seriousness of men who have already tried everything they know. Generals stand nearby, measuring each other with their eyes while pretending to measure the fever. And at the centre of it all is Alexander, king of Macedon, ruler of Asia, conqueror of the Persian Empire, still not yet 33 years old, and suddenly unable to rise. Only a short time before, he had seemed almost impossible to stop. He had crossed the Hellespont with a comparatively small army and had torn open the world of the old Persian kings. He had marched through Asia Minor, Syria, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Iran, Central Asia, and as far as the edge of India. Cities had surrendered to him, armies had broken before him, mountain fortresses had fallen, rivers had been crossed, deserts endured, rebellions crushed. And wounds survived that should have ended lesser men. He had been cut, pierced, bruised, starved, dehydrated, nearly drowned, and almost killed more than once. Yet each time he returned to the saddle, returned to the march, returned to the vision that drove him farther than most of his own companions wished to go. Now the movement stops inside a palace room in Babylon. The mystery begins not with a dramatic sword in the dark, not with an assassin stepping from behind a curtain, not with a single clean moment that history can hold in its hand. It begins more uneasily, with illness, a fever, pain, weakness, the gradual failure of a body that had carried an empire. Ancient writers describe the scene with fragments, contradictions, and rumours preserved through later copies of later accounts. Some say Alexander attended a drinking party before his sickness became obvious. Some describe a sudden sharp pain. Others give a slower account of fever worsening over days. The evidence remains incomplete, and because the evidence is incomplete, imagination has always entered the empty spaces. There are few deaths in ancient history more crowded with suspicion, poison, disease, betrayal, divine punishment, exhaustion, political murder, medical accident, a body simply pushed too far. Each answer has tempted someone. Each answer has problems. No single explanation fully accounts for every surviving detail, and the details themselves are not as secure as they first appear. The records that survive were written by men living after Alexander, sometimes long after him, relying on earlier sources now lost, shaped by politics, moral judgment, admiration, resentment, and the irresistible drama of a world conqueror dying before he could decide what his world would become. Yet the setting is real enough to feel close. Babylon in 323 BCE is not a ruin, not yet the shattered symbol of later imagination, but one of the great cities of the ancient Near East. Its old temples and processional ways still hold the memory of kings who claimed the favour of gods. Its people have seen conquerors before, Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, and now Macedonians have moved through its streets and palaces. The city sits in the flat heat of Mesopotamia, where water makes civilization possible and also brings danger. Canals feed fields and gardens, but stagnant channels can breed sickness. Summer heat presses on the body. Marshlands and riverbanks create a landscape where fevers are never far away. What survives in the record suggests that Alexander enters the city not as a resting king, but as a ruler, already planning the next impossible thing. He has not come to Babylon to disappear. He has come to organize, to summon ships, to inspect troops, to plan campaigns toward Arabia, perhaps beyond. His imagination remains larger than the map, even after the rebellion of his own exhausted soldiers in India, even after the brutal return through the Gedrosian desert, even after the death of his closest companion Hephaestion, even after years of wounds and suspicion and strained loyalties. Alexander still looks outward. The empire is not finished in his mind. It is only in need of another march. That ambition makes his sudden collapse more than a medical event. It becomes a political earthquake. The empire he rules is vast, but it is not yet settled. It is held together by his presence, his army, his charisma, his victories, and the fear or loyalty he inspires. There is no adult son ready to step into command. There is no simple constitution that says what happens when the king dies. Macedonian kingship has always carried a dangerous closeness to violence, rivalry, and personal loyalty. In Macedonia, succession is not always a quiet passage from father to son. It can be a contest, and contests around thrones rarely remain clean. Inside Babylon, the men around Alexander understand this. They are not ordinary officers. They are companions who have fought beside him, argued with him, benefited from him, feared him, and sometimes watched him kill or remove those he considered threats. They have governed provinces, commanded armies, married into Persian nobility, taken treasure, and built power of their own. Many owe everything to him. Some may also owe their survival to guessing what he wants before he says it. The deathbed of Alexander is therefore not only a human bedside, it is the centre of a storm that has not yet broken. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because the story that follows is not simply about how one man died, it is about how a body, an empire, and a legend all fail at once, and how the people left behind try to turn that failure into an explanation they can use. For the soldiers, the news spreads in fragments. Their king is ill. Their king cannot appear. The king is worse. In an army built around the presence of a living commander, absence becomes frightening. Alexander has always been seen. He leads charges. He visits wounded men. He attends sacrifices. He argues, rewards, punishes, drinks, plans, and appears before the army as if sheer visibility is part of kingship. When he vanishes behind walls, rumour rushes into the space he leaves. Ancient accounts describe troops eventually filing past him, perhaps to see that he still lives, perhaps to say farewell, perhaps because the army cannot believe that the man who crossed half the known world is now reduced to a silent figure on a bed. Some versions say he is too weak to speak, but still raises his head or gestures with his eyes. Whether every detail is exact remains uncertain, but the image has survived because it captures something deeper than documentation. The conqueror who once moved nations now communicates with almost nothing. It is easy to imagine the room was quiet, but it may not have felt peaceful. There is the breathing of a sick man, the murmuring of attendants, the footsteps of guards, the distant sound of a city that does not stop because a king is dying. Babylon continues outside the palace. Bakers still tend ovens, priests still perform rituals, boatmen still move goods along waterways, market sellers still argue over prices, animals still stir in courtyards, children still sleep under flat roofs in the heat. The everyday life of the city surrounds the most consequential deathbed of the age with complete indifference. History often feels enormous only after it has passed. At the moment itself, it happens among dust, sweat, confusion, and people waiting for someone else to decide what is true. The strange power of Alexander's death lies in this tension between the immense and the intimate. On one side stands the largest empire yet created by force of arms across the eastern Mediterranean and western Asia. On the other side lies a young man burning with fever, surrounded by people who cannot save him and may already be wondering what they can save for themselves. The body on the bed is human, damaged, vulnerable. The name attached to it is almost too large to fit inside a room. Scholars still debate the cause of his death because the surviving accounts leave too many openings. A sudden illness after drinking may suggest poisoning to some readers, but prolonged fever may suggest infection. Pain may point one way, weakness another. Silence at the end may be the natural result of severe illness, or it may have been shaped into a symbolic scene by later writers. The political consequences were so enormous that suspicion became almost inevitable. When a king dies, young and powerful men benefit. Poison becomes easier to believe. When the same king has spent years exhausting himself in war, wounds, stress, and climate, natural illness becomes just as plausible. When the empire collapses into rivalry almost immediately afterward, betrayal seems to hover even without proof. And so the first clue is not a cup, not a weapon, not a named murderer. The first clue is Babylon itself, a city of heat, water, old gods, new rulers, imperial ambition, and invisible disease. The second clue is Alexander's body, already carrying the accumulated cost of conquest. The third is the circle of men around him, each loyal in public, each dangerous in the future. The mystery forms where these three forces meet, a place that can sicken him, a body that may be ready to break, a court where death instantly becomes opportunity. By the time the fever deepens, the world Alexander has created is already waiting for his final breath. No one knows how to hold it together without him. No one can openly admit that yet. The physicians continue their work, the generals continue their watch, the army continues to wait, the city continues to breathe around them, and in that heavy Babylonian air, one of history's most unsettling questions begins to take shape, not as a puzzle with a clean solution, but as a shadow spreading outward from a bed where the conqueror of Asia lies still, and the future of his empire begins to tremble. The world Alexander leaves trembling inside Babylon does not appear suddenly. It is made over years of marching, bargaining, killing, persuading, and surviving. To understand why his death becomes so dangerous, it is necessary to see the strange shape of the empire that lies beneath his fever. It is not a kingdom in the old Macedonian sense. It is not simply Persia, with a Macedonian king placed on top. It is something newer, improvised almost faster than anyone can understand it. A vast political body stitched together by roads, garrisons, marriages, tribute, fear, admiration, and the personal force of one restless man. When Alexander first crosses into Asia, he does not yet hold the world. He carries the inheritance of his father, Philip II, who had transformed Macedonia from a rough northern kingdom into the dominant military power of Greece. Philip had created the army, hardened the officers, disciplined the infantry, strengthened the cavalry, and opened the path for war against Persia. Alexander inherits not only a throne but a machine already sharpened for conquest. Yet inheritance does not explain what follows. Many kings inherit strong armies. Few carry them through Anatolia, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Iran, Bactria, Sogdiana, and toward India. Few win so repeatedly that their victories begin to feel less like events than a change in the order of the world. The Persian Empire he attacks is ancient by Macedonian standards, wealthy beyond anything most of his soldiers have seen, and administratively sophisticated. It is a world of royal roads, satraps, tribute systems, palace cities, multilingual scribes, temple economies, and local elites who know how to survive under distant kings. It has ruled from the Aegean fringes to the Iranian plateau, from Egypt to Central Asia. Alexander does not conquer empty space. He enters a living imperial structure. And one of the surprises of his career is how often he keeps parts of that structure rather than destroying all of it. He removes the great king, but he cannot remove the habits that hold provinces together. What survives in the record suggests that Alexander understands, at least in practical terms, that winning battles is easier than ruling what the battles deliver. This creates one of the central tensions of his reign. To Macedonians, he is their king, first among warriors, a man expected to lead in battle and respect the fierce pride of his companions. To many Greeks, he is the leader of a campaign framed as revenge for Persian invasions generations earlier, though that grand language often sits beside very ordinary interests in plunder and power. To Egyptians, he becomes a pharaoh-like figure, connected to divine kingship in ways familiar to the Nile world. To Persians and other Iranian elites, he increasingly presents himself as successor to the Achaemenid kings, adopting elements of court ceremony, dress, administration, and dynastic symbolism. No single identity can contain him. The empire demands that he be different things to different people, and the effort strains both ruler and ruled. The farther he goes, the more visible that strain becomes. Macedonian veterans who followed him for glory and wealth begin to watch their king surround himself with Persian customs. They see Persian nobles restored or employed. They see marriages arranged between Macedonian officers and women from Iranian aristocratic families. They see young men from conquered peoples trained in Macedonian military ways. They see the king becoming not merely their war leader but the ruler of Asia. Some accept the change because success is difficult to argue with. Others resent it. Scholars still debate how far Alexander truly intended to fuse Macedonian and Persian elites into a lasting imperial class, but the evidence suggests he is at least experimenting with forms of rule that make many of his old companions uneasy. The empire therefore grows at a pace faster than trust can grow. Every conquered region has its own memory, its own gods, its own local power holders, and its own reasons to obey or rebel. Cities surrender because they must, not always because they believe. Satraps serve because service is safer than resistance, until it is not. Garrisons hold key places, but garrisons are thin threads across enormous distances. Messengers travel, orders are sent, taxes are gathered, soldiers are settled. But the whole system still depends on a central fact: Alexander is alive, victorious, and feared. His presence makes the improbable seem stable. This is why his deathbed in Babylon carries such weight. The empire is not yet old enough to run by habit. There has been no peaceful generation under Macedonian rule. No adult heir has grown up in the eyes of the army. No shared political language has fully emerged between Macedonian officers, Greek administrators, Persian nobles, Egyptian priests, Babylonian elites, and Central Asian horsemen. Alexander's conquests have created contact on an enormous scale. But contact is not the same as unity. Beneath the surface, rival histories remain intact. The treasure alone is enough to make men dangerous. The conquest of Persia releases wealth on a scale that transforms the ambitions of Alexander's followers. Gold and silver flow from royal treasuries. Cities are founded or refounded. Veterans expect rewards. Officers command territories larger than some kingdoms. In older Macedonia, noble power had been significant, but it remained tied to a relatively small homeland. In Alexander's empire, a general can imagine ruling Egypt, Syria, Mesopotamia, or Asia Minor. The map itself tempts them. A man who once competed for the king's favour can now look at a province and see a future dynasty. Yet during Alexander's life, ambition must wear the mask of loyalty. His companions know what happens to men suspected of conspiracy. They have watched trials, executions, forced suicides, and political purges. Alexander can be generous, intensely loyal, even emotionally attached, but he can also be terrifying. The killing of Cletus, the death of Philotas, the execution of Parmenion, and other episodes leave behind a warning that closeness to the king does not guarantee safety. The evidence remains incomplete in several of these cases, shaped by hostile and apologetic traditions, but the pattern is clear enough: the court around Alexander is brilliant, rewarded, and afraid. Fear is not always weakness. Sometimes it is the glue that holds a dangerous empire together. As long as Alexander lives, men who dislike one another keep serving under the same command. As long as he plans the next campaign, the army has direction. As long as treasure, promotion, and glory flow through him, loyalty has a practical shape. But if the king dies, the same bonds that once joined the empire can become lines of fracture. Companions become rivals, satrapies become prizes, armies become bargaining tools, royal women become political symbols, an unborn child becomes a possible king and a possible inconvenience. There is also the question of geography. Alexander's world stretches across environments that do not naturally belong to one political centre. The Macedonian homeland lies far to the west, with its mountains, royal traditions, and aristocratic clans. The old Persian heartlands lie far to the east and south, with palace cities, imperial roads, and noble families accustomed to serving kings but also preserving their own standing. Egypt sits along the Nile with a priestly and administrative culture older than Greek memory. Babylon stands in Mesopotamia, rich, symbolic, and practical. A city that Alexander seems to imagine as a new centre for power. Beyond lie highlands, deserts, steppes, and river valleys where loyalty can fade with distance. Holding all of this requires more than victory. It requires time. Alexander never receives that time. This is one of the quiet tragedies hidden beneath the louder mystery of his death. He conquers faster than institutions can harden. He commands faster than succession can be secured. He imagines new campaigns before old territories have fully accepted the last one. His empire is not a finished building, but scaffolding around a structure still being raised. From a distance, it looks magnificent. Up close, one sees ropes, gaps, strain, and men holding beams in place because the architect is still shouting orders. The image of Alexander as unstoppable can obscure this fragility. Legends prefer the shining figure on horseback, the young king cutting through impossible obstacles, the conqueror weeping for new worlds or pressing beyond the edge of maps. But the administrative reality is less clean and more revealing. He must appoint governors, punish corruption, found cities, settle veterans, replace dead officers, negotiate local customs, manage supply lines, keep Macedonian soldiers satisfied, and persuade conquered elites that cooperation will serve them better than revolt. These are not the tasks of a mythic hero. They are the daily burdens of empire, and they wear down even the most energetic ruler. No single explanation fully accounts for the speed with which Alexander's empire fractures after his death. But one reason is obvious: it has been built around a person more than a system. His charisma is not decorative, it is structural. His victories are not merely glorious, they are administrative currency. His personal relationships are not private, they are political architecture. Remove him, and the building does not immediately fall, but everyone inside hears the beams crack. This makes the final illness in Babylon feel even more ominous. The fever attacks one body, but that body has become the hinge of continents. Every rise in temperature, every hour of weakness, every failed treatment changes the calculations of men waiting outside the bedchamber. The question of poison or disease matters deeply, but before any diagnosis is made, the larger truth is already visible. Alexander's life has created a world that only Alexander knows how to command. His death will not merely end a reign, it will expose how much of the empire has been held together by movement, fear, hope, and the belief that tomorrow the king will rise and give another order. As Babylon settles into another hot night, that belief begins to weaken. The empire has roads, treasure, soldiers, ships, cities, scribes, temples, and governors. It has everything an empire seems to need, except the one thing it has never had to do without. It has no clear answer for the absence of Alexander. By the time Alexander reaches Babylon for the last time, his body is already a record of everything he has demanded from himself. The ancient world remembers him as young, and in years he is young, but youth in a campaign king is not the same as youth in peace. He has lived in armour, in saddle leather, in heat, in frost, in dust, in smoke, and in the narrow margin between victory and death. His face may still carry the force that artists later try to capture in marble and coinage. The upward gaze, the thick hair, the image of heroic intensity. But beneath the image is a human frame repeatedly battered by war, ceremony, travel, grief, alcohol, and ambition. The mystery of his death cannot be separated from the fact that Alexander has spent more than a decade treating his body as if it were another province to be conquered. He is wounded early and often. Ancient accounts preserve several injuries, though the details sometimes vary and later writers may sharpen the drama. At the Granicus, he comes close to death in the chaos of cavalry fighting. At Issus and Gaugamela, he rides into the centre of danger because Macedonian kings are expected to prove themselves in front of men who value visible courage. In Central Asia, the fighting grows uglier. Less like the great set-piece battles against Persia, and more like grinding resistance across mountains, fortresses, and difficult terrain. Near the Malian town in India, he suffers one of the most famous and serious wounds of his life when an arrow pierces him during a reckless assault. The wound nearly kills him. His men believe it for a terrifying time, that they may have lost him far from home. He survives, but survival is not the same as recovery. A body can continue after trauma while keeping the damage hidden inside. That hidden cost matters. Ancient medicine does not understand infection, internal injury, trauma response, or long-term organ damage in modern terms. A wound can close while weakness remains. A lung injury can scar. Repeated blood loss, fever, and exhaustion can leave a person outwardly functional and inwardly diminished. Scholars still debate how much Alexander's old wounds contributed to his final collapse, and the evidence remains incomplete. But it is difficult to imagine that years of injuries left no trace. He has been the point of the spear too many times. The king who seems invincible to his soldiers may be surviving by momentum. Momentum is one of the great themes of his life. Alexander rarely rests in the way ordinary men rest. After victory comes pursuit, after conquest comes reorganization, after one frontier comes another. He races through the Persian imperial world with a speed that astonishes even in summary, but that speed has practical consequences. Armies must be supplied, horses must be replaced, men must be punished, rewarded, encouraged, and frightened back into obedience. New cities must be founded. Satraps must be watched, letters must be sent across enormous distances, local elites must be drawn into cooperation, rituals must be performed, omens must be interpreted. The king is not merely a battlefield commander, he is the centre through which every demand passes. What survives in the record suggests a man of immense energy, but even immense energy is not endless. His emotional life also becomes more dangerous with time. The death of Hephaestion, his closest companion, wounds him in a way no arrow can. Ancient writers describe Alexander's grief as extreme, and though some details may be shaped by moralizing or theatrical tradition, the scale of mourning appears to have been real. Hephaestion is not only a friend, he is a trusted officer, a symbol of intimacy, a political partner in the inner circle of power. His death leaves Alexander furious, devastated, and perhaps less restrained. He orders honours on a massive scale. He punishes the physician who treated Hephaestion. He seeks divine recognition for the dead man. The grief is personal, but in a king it becomes public policy. The court sees that Alexander can be moved by sorrow into terrible decisions. Grief can change the body as well as the mind. It can disturb sleep, appetite, judgment, and resistance to illness. It can sharpen drinking habits. It can make a man who already lives at the edge of endurance push himself harder, not less. No physician in Babylon could have measured stress hormones, immune suppression, or the physical consequences of mourning. But modern readers can recognise the pattern without forcing certainty onto the evidence. Alexander arrives near the end not as a calm ruler beginning a settled reign, but as a bereaved conqueror still surrounded by unfinished plans. Alcohol is another part of the puzzle, though it must be handled carefully. Greek and Macedonian elite drinking culture is not identical to modern ideas of private addiction. Symposia, banquets, ceremonial drinking, and competitive consumption all belong to the social world of aristocratic men. Macedonians in particular have a reputation in ancient sources for heavy drinking, and Alexander's own drinking becomes a repeated theme. Yet ancient writers often use alcohol as moral evidence. A king who dies after drinking can become an example of excess. A conqueror who behaves violently at a banquet can be turned into a warning about pride. The killing of Cleitus, committed during a drunken quarrel, casts a long shadow over the tradition. It shows how alcohol, anger, grief, and royal power can combine with catastrophic results. The issue is not simply whether Alexander drinks heavily before his final illness. Some accounts suggest the sickness follows a banquet, and this detail helps later poison stories grow. But the broader question is what years of heavy drinking might have done to a body already injured and overworked. Alcohol can weaken judgment, disrupt sleep, aggravate inflammation, and worsen the body's ability to recover. In an ancient environment where water quality varies and disease is common, drinking wine is ordinary, but excess remains excess. No single explanation fully accounts for this, and the sources do not allow a clean diagnosis from across more than 2,000 years. Still, the image of Alexander as a man burning through his reserves feels historically plausible. There is also the simple violence of travel. The modern imagination often measures empire by lines on a map, but Alexander's empire is experienced through feet, hooves, boats, carts, river crossings, mountain passes, desert marches, and camp life. Men sleep under canvas, in borrowed houses, in tents, in palaces, in mud, in heat, and in cold. They eat what supply allows. They drink from streams, wells, rivers, and stored vessels. They endure flies, mosquitoes, parasites, bad food, spoiled water, infected cuts, and the constant closeness of men and animals. A king receives better care than most, but he cannot escape the biological world of his army. Disease follows armies because armies create ideal conditions for it. Crowding, movement, stress, and unfamiliar environments carry invisible dangers no ancient commander can see. Alexander has already seen his men suffer under such conditions. The return through the Gedrosian desert is especially brutal. Ancient accounts describe thirst, heat, hunger, exhaustion, and death on a devastating scale. Though numbers may be exaggerated by later tradition, even if reduced to more cautious estimates, the campaign is a disaster for the human body. Men die not in glorious battle but in sand, heat, and logistical failure. Alexander survives again. But the survival of the leader does not erase the strain of the march. It adds another layer to the accumulated burden. Ambition keeps pulling him forward. That ambition is not merely personal vanity, though vanity surely has its place. It is bound to kingship, mythology, competition with heroes of the past, rivalry with his father's memory, and the practical need to keep a conquering army occupied. A king who stops may look weak. A king who has built his legitimacy through victory must continue to produce victory, or invent a new foundation for rule. Alexander's planned Arabian campaign may have served trade, naval strategy, exploration, and imperial consolidation. But it also continues the pattern. Movement prevents stagnation. Movement postpones the problem of what the empire is supposed to be when conquest slows. This is the cruel paradox. The same relentless energy that makes Alexander extraordinary may also make him vulnerable. He cannot easily become a quiet administrator. He cannot easily retreat into palace routine. He has trained himself and his army to expect the next horizon. By Babylon, the king is preparing ships, troops, and plans while his body carries the debt of everything already done. The body may appear obedient until, suddenly, it is not. So when the fever comes, it does not strike a blank slate. It strikes a man with old wounds, possible internal damage, years of irregular sleep, heavy drinking, emotional shock, repeated exposure to disease, and the pressure of ruling an empire too large to relax around him. Poison remains possible in the imagination because courts are dangerous and powerful men have motives. Disease remains possible because the environment is dangerous and human bodies fail. Betrayal remains possible because politics does not pause at the bedside. But beneath every theory lies the same quieter truth: Alexander's life has been an assault on ordinary limits. The mystery is not only that he dies young. Many people in the ancient world die young. The mystery is that this particular young man has seemed to outrun consequence for so long, the consequence itself appears suspicious when it finally catches him. Babylon does not need to invent all the danger. Some of it arrives with him, already written beneath the skin. Babylon receives Alexander not as a passive backdrop, but as a city heavy with memory and unease. By the time he returns there in 323 BCE, it has already belonged to many worlds. It has been the heart of Babylonian kingship, a prize of Assyrian conquest, a jewel of the Persian Empire, and now the chosen stage for a Macedonian ruler who wants to command Asia from one of Asia's oldest centres of power. The city is not merely large, it is symbolic. To enter Babylon is to step into a place where kings have long claimed that rule on earth must be arranged in conversation with heaven, where temples, canals, walls, and palaces make power feel older than any living dynasty. Alexander, who has spent his life moving forward, returns to a city that seems to gather the past around him. The landscape itself matters. Babylon sits on the flat alluvial plain of Mesopotamia, where the Euphrates and a network of canals make agriculture possible in a region that depends on managed water. This is a world built by irrigation, labour, and calculation. Fields exist because water is guided. Cities survive because channels are cleared, embankments maintained, and seasonal rhythms understood. But the same waters that feed fields can also make the air heavy and dangerous. Canals can stagnate. Marshy zones can harbour insects. Summer heat can turn enclosed spaces oppressive. Ancient people may not understand disease in microbial terms, but they know perfectly well that some places and seasons bring fevers. Babylon's greatness is inseparable from its wet heat, its fertile mud, and its vulnerability to the illnesses that accompany dense human life near slow water. When Alexander chooses Babylon as a major centre for his future plans, he's making a practical decision and a statement. The city lies closer to the middle of the empire than Macedonia does. It connects westward towards Syria and the Mediterranean, southward toward the Persian Gulf, eastward toward Iran, and northward into Mesopotamian routes of movement and supply. For a king thinking about Arabia, fleets, trade, and further campaigns, Babylon offers access. It is an old imperial machine waiting to be used by a new master. What survives in the record suggests that Alexander is not drifting there without purpose. He is summoning forces, receiving embassies, organising ships, and imagining another expansion before the last conquest has settled into peace. Yet Babylon is also a city of warnings. Ancient accounts describe ominous signs before Alexander's death, especially warnings from Chaldean priests or astrologers who urge him not to enter the city, or at least not to enter it in a particular way. These stories are difficult to handle because they may have grown after the event, shaped by the human desire to believe that a death so enormous must have cast a shadow before it happened. In ancient history, omens often become clearer after the disaster they supposedly foretold. A strange incident, a misread ritual, an anxious priest, a nervous rumour, all can be remembered later as prophecy. Scholars still debate what, if anything, lies behind these traditions, but even if the details are uncertain, they reveal something important later generations could not imagine Alexander's final arrival in Babylon as ordinary. The city had to feel charged before the fever came. For the people of Babylon, Alexander is both conqueror and restorer, foreigner and king. He has shown respect for some local religious traditions, and he has an interest in great temples, especially those tied to ancient legitimacy. The relationship between Macedonian rule and Babylonian priestly culture is not simple. Conquerors need local knowledge, temples need royal favour, priests know calendars, rituals, land, labour, and the language of legitimacy. Alexander's power is military. But in Babylon, military power alone is not enough to make kingship feel complete. A ruler who wants to inherit Asia must learn to stand in older frames of authority, even when his army views some of those frames with suspicion or impatience. This creates another layer of tension around him. Alexander is still surrounded by Macedonian companions whose loyalty was formed in battle, not in Babylonian ritual. They may tolerate foreign ceremony when it serves victory, but many remain uneasy with the idea that their king is becoming something more Eastern, more divine, more distant. He has already pushed them through experiments in court protocol that many Greeks and Macedonians dislike. He has married Roxana and later taken additional wives in the mass marriage ceremonies at Susa, where he also encourages his officers to marry Persian noblewomen. He has brought foreign youths into military training. Each act can be explained politically, but politics does not remove resentment. Babylon, with its temples and ancient grandeur, may intensify the feeling that Alexander's future empire will not belong primarily to the old Macedonian camp. The city also fills with people who want something from him. Envoys come, officers report, engineers, shipbuilders, soldiers, administrators, priests, and petitioners move through the orbit of the court. The palace is not a quiet royal home. It is a pressure chamber. Decisions made there can affect lands months of travel away. Rumours move quickly because everyone's future depends on royal attention. Who is promoted, who is forgiven, who is suspected, who receives money, who commands troops, who governs a province, who enters the king's presence at the right hour. All of this matters. In such an environment, illness does not remain private for long. A cough can become a whisper. A fever can become a political fact. Before the fever, Alexander's plans are ambitious enough to unsettle even loyal men. The proposed Arabian expedition is not a small raid. It appears to involve naval preparation, coastal exploration, and the possible extension of imperial control around the Arabian Peninsula and Persian Gulf. Ancient sources differ in emphasis, and the evidence remains incomplete, but the direction is clear. Alexander does not intend to stop. Some in the army may see opportunity in this. Others may see exhaustion dressed as glory. Veterans who already refused to go farther east in India have been promised return, rewards, and settlement. Many have followed him for years beyond the familiar world. To them, another campaign may feel less like destiny and more like proof that the king's hunger has no natural end. This matters because an army's obedience depends on more than fear. It depends on belief that the leader understands the limits of men. Alexander has often tested those limits. Sometimes he has rewarded suffering with treasure and honour. Sometimes he has met resistance with anger. At Opis, when his Macedonian veterans object to his policies and their replacement by Asian troops, he responds with a theatrical severity that reveals both his genius and his danger. He can manipulate emotion brilliantly. He can shame, punish, reconcile, and bind men back to him. But each crisis leaves marks. The army loves him, fears him, depends on him, and resents him in ways that are hard to separate. Babylon, then, is crowded not only with bodies but with unresolved conflicts. Macedonian and Persian models of rule stand uneasily together. Old companions compete for influence. Local elites watch for advantage. Soldiers wonder whether they are going home or marching again into heat, disease, and distance. Religious specialists interpret signs. Administrators prepare for orders. Ships gather for a campaign not yet begun. The king moves through all this with his usual force. But the environment around him is saturated with strain. The physical city reinforces that feeling. Imagine its broad spaces, its mud brick masses, its high walls, its processional routes, its temple precincts, its palatial courtyards. Imagine gardens and storerooms, scribal rooms and barracks, kitchens, stables, granaries, river landings, and shaded chambers where decisions are made behind guarded doors. In the day, the heat presses downward. At night, the warmth lingers in brick and water. Mosquitoes gather where water slows. Food spoils quickly in the heat. Wine flows at elite gatherings. Sacrifices are performed, reports delivered, messages received, plans revised. The empire's machinery turns, but it turns inside a city where the body is constantly negotiating with climate. No single explanation fully accounts for what happens next, but Babylon provides conditions for nearly every theory to grow. For those who suspect disease, the city offers heat, water, insects, crowding, and seasonal fevers. For those who suspect poison, the court offers banquets, rivals, access, and motive. For those who suspect betrayal, the empire offers a succession crisis waiting behind one man's pulse. For those who prefer omen and legend, Babylon offers ancient gods, uneasy priests. And the narrative weight of a city too old to seem innocent? Alexander may not feel doomed as he enters this world. He is still planning, commanding, and imagining the future. That is part of the tragedy. History often becomes most dramatic when the people inside it do not yet know the shape of the disaster. To Alexander, Babylon may look like a launching point. To later memory, it becomes a trap. Between those two visions lies the fragile present, a king preparing to move again, a city breathing heat around him, and an empire held so tightly in his hands that no one can yet admit how quickly it might slip away. The illness begins in the uncertain space between celebration and collapse. Ancient accounts do not give one perfectly stable version of the first moment, and that instability has fed the mystery for more than 2,000 years. Some traditions place Alexander at a banquet, drinking with companions in the familiar style of Macedonian aristocratic life. Others describe a sequence of feasts, sacrifices, baths, and late gatherings, with his health failing gradually rather than in a single dramatic instant. One version remembers a sudden stabbing pain after he drains a cup, a detail that later writers find almost impossible to resist because it sounds like the beginning of a murder. Another version is quieter, less theatrical, and perhaps more medically plausible fever appears, worsens, and slowly conquers him. What survives in the record suggests not a clear scene preserved under glass, but a cluster of memories shaped by politics, rumour, and the need to explain why the strongest man in the empire suddenly cannot stand. The banquet setting matters because Alexander's world is a world where drinking is never just drinking. It is social ritual, masculine performance, aristocratic bonding, royal theatre, and sometimes a dangerous test of loyalty. Around the cup, men compete, flatter, provoke, remember battles, reopen old wounds, and measure their distance from the king. The Macedonian court has long been rougher and more direct than many Greek observers prefer. And ancient writers often portray Macedonian drinking as heavy, unrestrained, and capable of turning violent. This reputation may be exaggerated by outsiders, but Alexander's own life gives it some force. A banquet has already become one of the darkest places in his memory because Cletus, the man who once saved him in battle, dies by Alexander's own hand after a drunken quarrel. That killing remains a warning that royal drinking can turn into royal disaster. So when later readers hear that Alexander's final illness follows a feast, suspicion naturally gathers around the cup. A king drinks among men who know the palace. A pain begins, the body fails, powerful men wait nearby, the empire is leaderless, The story almost writes itself in, but history is rarely so obedient. The ancient evidence does not allow the cup to become a murder weapon with certainty. The dramatic pain appears in some accounts, but not all. The timing varies. Details may have been added or sharpened by those who wanted a death worthy of the legend, or by those who needed villains for political reasons. Scholars still debate whether the banquet should be treated as a crucial clue, or merely as the ordinary setting in which an already sick man first notices that something is wrong. It is possible that Alexander has been unwell before the famous gathering. In the days surrounding his final illness, he is engaged in sacrifices, drinking, planning, receiving guests, and preparing military operations. A man accustomed to pushing through discomfort may ignore early symptoms. Fever can begin quietly. A headache, a chill, stomach pain, fatigue, or a sense of weakness might be dismissed as the cost of heat, wine, poor sleep, or strain. Kings are not encouraged to be fragile. Alexander especially has built his authority around visible endurance. He has crossed deserts, fought through wounds, and returned from near death. For him to withdraw too early might feel unnatural, even impossible. The body whispers before it screams, and Alexander has spent much of his life refusing to listen. The first pain, if it happened as described, has attracted enormous attention. Some ancient narratives say that after drinking a large cup, Alexander feels as though struck by a spear in the back or side. This image is vivid, almost too vivid, and that is part of the problem. It fits the dramatic grammar of assassination. It turns internal suffering into battlefield language, as if the conqueror can only be defeated by a hidden weapon. Yet severe infections, pancreatitis-like conditions, gastrointestinal illness, gallbladder trouble, complications from alcohol, or other acute medical problems can also cause sudden intense pain. Without reliable clinical details, certainty is impossible. The evidence remains incomplete, and every medical reconstruction must admit that ancient symptom reports are filtered through literary habits, translation, memory, and the expectations of readers. Still, once pain becomes public, the atmosphere changes. A banquet is supposed to reinforce the hierarchy of the court. Men gather around the king, not only to drink but to orbit power. When the centre of that orbit falters, every face in the room matters. Some may be genuinely alarmed. Some may hide alarm behind controlled expressions. Some may think first of friendship, others of command, succession, advantage, or danger. In courts, emotion and calculation do not exclude each other. A man can love Alexander and still wonder what his death would mean. A man can fear Alexander and still dread the chaos that follows. A man can be loyal in the moment and ambitious by sunrise. The physicians, when they enter the story, stand at the edge of what ancient medicine can do. Greek medical traditions have observation, diet, regimen, bleeding, purging, baths, cooling and warming treatments, and theories about humours and balance. Babylonian and Near Eastern healing traditions also include long experience with symptoms, herbs, ritual, and prognosis. None of these systems can identify bacteria, viruses, mosquito-borne disease, organ failure, or toxicology in modern terms. A royal physician can watch, smell, touch, prescribe, and pray. But the most important battle may be invisible. If Alexander's illness is infectious, no one knows the enemy. If it is poisoning, no one has a modern method to prove it. If it is a combination of stress, alcohol, old wounds, and disease, the complexity is beyond any ancient bedside. The first night of illness may therefore have felt suspended between ordinary sickness and something more ominous. A king can have a fever and recover. Alexander has recovered from worse-looking dangers before. His companions may initially expect the same. Perhaps he rests, receives treatment, and prepares to resume duties. Perhaps the court attempts to control the news, because royal weakness is dangerous even when temporary, outside the chamber. The machinery of imperial business continues because it must. Ships still need orders, officers still wait, sacrifices still follow the calendar. The city does not pause simply because the king is unwell. At first, the empire may treat the illness as an interruption, but interruptions can become revelations. As the fever does not break, the meaning of the banquet changes in memory. What seemed like a heavy night of drinking becomes the possible beginning of a plot. What seemed like pain becomes evidence. What seemed like delay becomes concealment. Later factions have reasons to shape the story. If Alexander was poisoned, then someone is guilty, and guilt can be aimed at political enemies. If he died from excess, then moralists can turn his life into a lesson about ambition and self-control. If he died from disease, then the gods of history look colder, less dramatic, and more indifferent. Ancient writers often prefer meaningful deaths, but bodies are not obligated to die meaningfully. There is also the issue of timing. Poison stories work best when death follows quickly, but Alexander's illness lasts many days. That does not make poisoning impossible, because some toxins act slowly and some accounts may be distorted, but it complicates the simplest version. A prolonged fever suggests infection to many modern scholars, yet fever itself can accompany many conditions, and ancient descriptions may use broad language. The longer he lingers, the more the court has time to become anxious, secretive, and divided. A sudden assassination would create one kind of crisis. A slow decline creates another, more psychologically corrosive one. It gives men time to hope, fear, plan, deny, and whisper. By the end of the early phase, the mystery has already entered its permanent form. There is a possible meal, a possible cup, a possible pain, a definite fever, an uncertain sequence, and a court full of men whose later actions will make everyone look backward with suspicion. The room in Babylon begins to transform from a sick room into a political chamber. Every treatment, every report, every delay in public appearance becomes part of the story. Alexander's body is no longer private matter. If it ever was, it is the Empire's central document, and no one can read it clearly. The strange cruelty of this first stage is that almost nothing decisive happens, and yet everything changes. The king becomes ill. That is all that can be said with confidence. But because the king is Alexander, illness is not merely illness. It is an opening in the wall of the world he has built. Through that opening come suspicion, fear, ambition, medical uncertainty, and the first cold realization that the man who has survived spears, arrows, rivers, deserts, sieges, and mutiny may have met something that does not need to face him in battle. It only needs to remain inside him, hidden, patient, and unnamed. The days after the first signs of illness move with a strange slowness. In battle, Alexander's life often turns on moments measured in heartbeats: a cavalry charge, a spear thrust, an arrow loosed from a wall, a river crossing under pressure, a decision made before dust has settled. In Babylon, the pace changes. The enemy, if it can be called that, does not ride toward him with banners. It advances hour by hour through fever, weakness, thirst, pain, sleeplessness, and the body's quiet surrender. The conqueror who has forced cities to yield now faces a siege from within, and no one around him can see where the walls are breaking. Ancient accounts describe the final illness as lasting roughly 11 or 12 days, though the exact chronology depends on which tradition is followed. Some versions are organised almost like a royal diary, listing sacrifices, baths, drinking, sleeping quarters, worsening fever, audiences, and moments when Alexander can no longer perform ordinary duties. Such records may preserve elements of an official court journal, but scholars still debate how much later writers altered, selected, or misunderstood the material. The result is a sequence that feels close enough to be haunting and distant enough to remain slippery. Each day seems to promise clarity, and each day withholds it. At first, Alexander appears to continue functioning. He performs sacrifices, he gives orders, he meets officers, he may be moved between quarters. This detail matters because it suggests the illness does not immediately destroy him. Whatever strikes him, it allows a period in which he remains conscious and active enough to maintain the appearance of command. That appearance is vital. A Macedonian king cannot easily vanish into private suffering. His body is part of public authority. If he can speak, he must speak. If he can give orders, he must give them. If he can be seen, he must be seen, because an unseen king creates a vacuum long before he dies. But fever has its own authority. It reduces the world. The empire that once stretched across continents shrinks to bedding. Cups, sweat, shadows, hands, and the next difficult breath. The royal chamber becomes a landscape of small signs. Is he sleeping more? Is the fever rising? Does he recognize the men nearby? Can he lift his head? Can he swallow? Can he speak clearly? In the absence of modern instruments, attendants must read the body through touch, colour, sound, and habit. A change in breathing can frighten them. A moment of alertness can revive hope. The body becomes a text, but one written in a language no one fully understands. Outside the chamber, information becomes power. The generals and companions need to know how ill he is, but knowledge itself is dangerous. If the king recovers, anyone who has behaved too eagerly for succession may be ruined. If he dies, anyone who has failed to prepare may be swept aside. This produces an atmosphere of careful faces and guarded speech. Men who have crossed deserts together and stood in battle lines together now wait in a palace where every pause carries meaning. Loyalty remains necessary, but ambition begins to awaken like something that has only been sleeping out of fear. The army's anxiety grows as Alexander weakens. For years, soldiers have endured what they endured because he was there, visible and demanding. He has rewarded them with wealth, but he has also taken them beyond their limits. They have cursed him, loved him, feared him, and followed him into places many never imagined. Now they hear that he lies ill behind palace walls. Rumour moves faster than official announcement. One group says he is recovering, another says he is dying. Another says he has already died and the generals are hiding it. In such a situation, even silence becomes a message. The longer Alexander does not appear, the more the army feels the ground shifting beneath its feet. One of the most powerful traditions from these final days describes the soldiers filing past the dying king. The scene is difficult to verify in all its details, yet it has endured because it speaks to the relationship between Alexander and his men more deeply than any administrative document could. The Macedonian soldiers, perhaps refusing to believe he still lives, perhaps demanding to see him, are allowed to pass before him. He is too weak to speak. He acknowledges them with his eyes or a slight movement. The men who once saw him at the front of cavalry charges now see him motionless, stripped of the terrible energy that made him seem larger than ordinary kings. For an army built around presence, this is almost unbearable. The silence of Alexander at the end has created many interpretations. Some later writers make it symbolic, as if the king who once commanded nations can no longer name a successor because destiny itself refuses to cooperate. Others treat it as a medical detail, the natural result of severe illness. The evidence remains incomplete. Yet the silence is crucial because succession depends on speech. A living command from Alexander might not have prevented conflict, but it would have shaped it. A named heir, a clear regent, a declared plan for the empire. Even a strong final instruction could have given his followers something to obey or oppose. Instead, the final days seem to produce ambiguity. Ambiguity is fertile ground for civil war. There is a famous tradition that when asked to whom he leaves the empire, Alexander gives an answer that can be understood as to the strongest. The phrase is unforgettable, but its historicity is uncertain. It may reflect what happened afterward more than what he actually said. Later generations, looking at the wars of his successors, may have found in that phrase the perfect explanation for the violence that followed. Whether he spoke it or not, the empire behaves as if he had strength. Not order becomes the measure, but during the days of decline, even that brutal clarity has not yet arrived. The men around him still wait in the suspended space between king and corpse. The medical course itself remains debated. A fever lasting day after day could point toward infectious disease, especially in the environment of Mesopotamia. If symptoms included abdominal pain, weakness, and progressive decline, some scholars have considered typhoid fever, others have suggested malaria, though the pattern is not certain. Other possibilities have been raised, including viral infections, complications from earlier wounds, acute pancreatitis, or other conditions that cannot be proven from the sources. No single diagnosis fully accounts for every report, partly because the reports are not clinical records in the modern sense. They are ancient narratives, shaped by memory, literary form, and political need. What can be imagined with more confidence is the human rhythm of decline. Fever burns through the nights. The heat of Babylon gives little mercy. Wet cloths may be applied, wine or water may be offered, physicians may adjust diet, baths, purges, or cooling regimens according to their theories. Priests or diviners may be consulted, sacrifices performed, omens watched, friends may remain close, though closeness to the king in such a moment is both honour and danger. Guards control access. Servants carry messages. Palace, usually a place of movement and command, begins to orbit a single bed. As his strength fades, Alexander's plans remain scattered around him like abandoned weapons. The Arabian expedition, the fleet preparations, the administrative reforms, the settlements, the unfinished integration of Macedonian and Persian elites, all of it waits for a king who may no longer be capable of directing anything. This is one of the eerie features of sudden historical death. The future does not disappear immediately. It remains present in documents, ships, orders, supplies, and expectations, even after the person who imagined it can no longer move toward it. Babylon is full of a future that depends on Alexander rising. Each day he does not rise, that future becomes less real. The men around him are forced to confront an unspoken fact: the empire has been prepared for expansion, not succession. Alexander has trained everyone to look outward, toward the next conquest, the next horizon, the next display of royal energy. He has not trained them to live after him. Perhaps he assumes there will be time. Perhaps he believes his future sons will inherit. Perhaps he avoids the question because naming a successor too early could create danger while he is still alive. Scholars still debate how Alexander understood his own mortality and dynastic plans. What survives suggests not a settled design, but a dangerous absence at the heart of power. By the final days, the illness has done what no enemy army has managed to do. It has stopped the movement. It has forced every faction, every officer, every soldier, and every subject watching from a distance to imagine the same impossible thing: Alexander may die. The thought is not merely sad or shocking. It is structurally terrifying. If he dies, commands become claims, loyalty becomes negotiation, friendship becomes faction, the empire becomes a question. And still Babylon continues around him. The river moves, the canals glimmer under heat, the old temples stand. Palace walls hold in the voices of men who do not know whether they are witnessing natural illness, hidden murder, divine warning, or the ordinary failure of a body used too fiercely for too long. On the 12th day, or near it, depending on the account, the long decline reaches its end. The fever has outlasted the king's strength. Alexander, who made the world move, becomes still. In that stillness, suspicion begins its second life. The illness is over, but the mystery has only begun to breathe. Once Alexander is dead, the poison theory becomes almost inevitable. It does not need proof to survive. It needs motive, opportunity, fear, and a death that feels too large to be ordinary. A fever may kill a farmer without leaving behind a legend. A fever may kill a soldier and be accepted as one more loss in a hard world. But when the ruler of the largest empire of his age dies young in a palace full of ambitious men, natural illness begins to look suspicious simply because the consequences are so enormous. The body stops breathing, and the court begins to reinterpret everything that happened before the final breath. The accusation of poison appears in ancient tradition, but not with the clean certainty that a mystery demands. Some accounts emphasize it, others reject it or ignore it. Later writers preserve stories in which a deadly substance is brought from Macedonia, hidden in a mule's hoof, delivered through trusted hands, and administered at just the right moment. These details are vivid, almost cinematic, and that vividness is part of their attraction. They turn the slow confusion of illness into a plot with actors, tools, and intention. Yet the evidence remains incomplete, and the more carefully the story is examined, the more it begins to look like a tradition shaped by politics after the fact, not a secure report from the bedside. The most famous suspicions point back toward Antipater, the powerful Macedonian regent left in charge of affairs in Europe during Alexander's long absence. Antipater is not a minor figure. He is experienced, politically skilled, and deeply embedded in the Macedonian power structure. He has governed while Alexander campaigns across Asia. He has managed rebellions, Greek unrest, royal correspondence, and the difficult task of serving a king who is far away but never truly absent. By the final year of Alexander's life, relations between the king and Antipater appear strained. Alexander has reportedly ordered Antipater to come to Asia and be replaced in Macedonia by Craterus, another trusted commander. For a man of Antipater's standing, such a summons could be dangerous. Macedonian politics teaches that distance from royal favour can become distance from life. This is where motive enters. If Antipater fears removal, disgrace, or execution, then Alexander's death benefits him. If his family or allies fear the same, they too might have reason to act. Ancient poison narratives often involve Antipater's sons, especially Cassander and Aeolus. Aeolus, sometimes identified as a cupbearer, is an especially useful figure for the story, because a cupbearer gives poison theories the intimacy they require. The killer must be near the king's drink. Cassander later becomes deeply involved in the violent politics of the successor period, and his hostility toward Alexander's memory is emphasized by some traditions. In hindsight, the family becomes easy to darken. Later readers already know that the house of Antipater will be tangled in the struggles after Alexander's death, so suspicion travels backward. But motive is not proof. Many men have motives at royal courts. Few can safely act on them. Poisoning Alexander would be an act of almost unimaginable risk. The murderer would need access, secrecy, a substance capable of killing slowly enough or subtly enough to avoid immediate detection, and confidence that the death would not trigger investigation, torture, revenge, or massacre. If Alexander had suspected poison while still able to speak, his response might have been catastrophic. Even after his death, his soldiers could turn violently against anyone named as assassin. To kill such a king is not simply to remove a man. It is to gamble against the fury of an army that has treated him as the living source of its fortune. The timing also complicates the theory. Alexander's illness lasts many days. A poison that causes immediate severe pain and then a slow febrile decline is possible in broad imagination, but harder to match neatly with known ancient toxins. Later defenders of the poison theory have suggested various substances, but ancient narratives do not provide reliable clinical detail. The fever, gradual weakness, and extended course often seem more consistent with disease than with a simple poisoning. This does not eliminate poisoning entirely, because some toxins act slowly and ancient reports may be distorted, but it prevents the theory from becoming the easy answer. No single explanation fully accounts for all of the symptoms as they are transmitted. There is also the problem of silence among those closest to events. If Alexander's death had been widely believed to be murder immediately, one might expect a more direct explosion of revenge. Instead, the immediate political crisis centers on succession, regency, and control of the empire. Accusations of poisoning appear, but they do not produce a universally accepted culprit. That pattern suggests either that the evidence was weak, or that those who suspected murder lacked the power to act. Or that later political factions found the accusation useful after the immediate moment had passed. In the world after Alexander, blaming poison could serve many purposes. It could blacken an enemy, explain chaos, excuse failure, or preserve the image of Alexander as a man too great to be defeated by ordinary illness. That last point is important. Poison protects the legend. If Alexander dies of disease, then he is vulnerable to the same invisible forces that kill countless unnamed people in the ancient world. If he dies by poison, then he remains undefeated in a symbolic sense. No army beats him, no rival surpasses him. He is brought down only by treachery, by something hidden, cowardly, and unworthy of him. Such a death fits heroic storytelling. It also fits the emotional needs of followers who cannot accept that the man who survived so much might have been killed by fever in a hot river city. Yet poison stories are not always invented from nothing. Courts do use poison. Ancient politics is full of suspicion, and some suspicions are justified. The Macedonian royal house itself has a violent history. Philip II, Alexander's father, was assassinated. Dynastic rivals had been killed. Noble factions could be ruthless. Alexander had ordered executions when he believed threats existed. In such a world, the idea of murder is not absurd. It belongs to the political atmosphere. What remains uncertain is whether that atmosphere produced the actual death, or merely shaped the way people explained it afterward. The poison theory also reflects the dangerous relationship between Alexander and the men who served him. His companions are not powerless courtiers trapped around a throne. They are commanders with armies, wealth, reputations, and followers. During his life, they depend on him. After his death, they become possible kings in all but name. This creates a retrospective problem. Since many of them benefit from his absence, all of them can look guilty. The empire's structure turns suspicion into a net wide enough to catch almost everyone. Antipater may have motive, other generals may also have motive, disgruntled Macedonians may have motive, Persian nobles displaced by his policies may have motive, Greeks resentful of Macedonian domination may have motive, even those who love him may fear what one more campaign will demand. But a theory that can implicate everyone can also begin to lose sharpness. Suspicion needs direction. Without solid evidence, Poison becomes a shadow that moves wherever later politics points it. If one faction wants to attack another, the death of Alexander offers the perfect weapon, accuse the rival not merely of ambition, but of murdering the king whose memory still commands awe. In the successor wars, legitimacy is scarce. Each general needs some connection to Alexander. Some claim to preserve his legacy, avenge him, protect his family, or inherit his mission. In that struggle, stories about his death are not neutral memories, they are instruments. There is a darker human reason the poison theory endures. It makes death intentional. Disease is chaotic, indifferent, and humiliating. It reduces kings and servants alike to fever. Poison gives the mind a plot to follow. Someone did this. Someone can be blamed. Someone can be hated. In a shattered empire, blame is a kind of order. It cannot bring Alexander back, but it can make the catastrophe feel less random. Still, when the evidence is weighed with caution, poison remains possible but unproven. The surviving sources are late, divided, and shaped by agendas. The symptoms do not clearly demand a toxin. The political motives are real, but motives surround every throne. The dramatic details may preserve rumour rather than fact. Scholars still debate the issue because the case cannot be closed from the surviving record. There is no body to test, no reliable toxicology, no contemporary medical chart, no confession that can be trusted. There is only the fever, the court, the aftermath, and the stories people told once the empire began to break apart. In the end, the poison theory reveals as much about Alexander's world as it does about Alexander's body. It reveals a court where trust is fragile, a succession where ambiguity is fatal, and a legend so powerful that ordinary death feels insufficient. Whether poison passed his lips or not, suspicion certainly entered the palace. It entered because the men around him knew what power was worth. It entered because Babylon held too many ambitions in one place. It entered because Alexander had made himself the centre of everything, and when the centre failed, everyone searched for a hand that might have pushed it. The poison theory becomes more complicated when it leaves the court and enters the body. Motive can be imagined easily. Access can be debated. Political hatred can be supplied from nearly every direction. But poison must do something physical. It must move through the mouth, stomach, blood, nerves, organs, and breath. It must create symptoms that match, at least roughly, the surviving descriptions. It must kill in a way that makes sense not only as a story, but as a biological event. This is where the dramatic tradition begins to strain, because ancient poisons are frightening, but they are not magical. They have limits, they have tastes, delays, patterns, and failures. A hidden enemy may be subtle, but the human body still leaves clues, even when those clues are blurred by 2,000 years of retelling. The ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern worlds knew many toxic substances: hemlock, aconite, arsenic compounds, hellebore, opium in dangerous quantities, toxic plants, venom, and mixtures of minerals or herbs all belonged in the shadowed space between medicine and murder. Physicians used some dangerous substances in controlled ways, or believed they could. Poisoners used knowledge from gardens, mines, snakes, and apothecaries. Royal courts feared such things because poison could cross the distance that armour and guards were meant to protect. A knife required proximity and violence. Poison could be placed in food, wine, medicine, or ritual drink. It was the weapon of suspicion because it could hide inside hospitality. Yet the famous versions of Alexander's poisoning face immediate problems. One tradition says the poison was so powerful it had to be carried in the hoof of a mule or some other special container because ordinary vessels could not hold it. This detail has the flavour of legend. It does not behave like practical toxicology so much as moral imagination. A poison too strong for normal containers is the kind of object a story invents when ordinary poison feels insufficient for an extraordinary victim. It magnifies the murder to match the man. The evidence remains incomplete, but details like this encourage caution. They may preserve the emotional scale of suspicion rather than the physical reality of the substance. If a poison were placed in wine at a banquet, taste would be a serious concern. Ancient wine was often mixed, flavoured, diluted, spiced, or served in contexts where strong sensations might be less noticeable. But many toxins are bitter, burning, metallic, or otherwise difficult to conceal. A royal cupbearer could mask a taste, perhaps, or the drink might already be strong enough to hide something unpleasant. But Alexander is not drinking alone. Banquet service involves attendants, companions, shared vessels, and repeated pouring. The more people involved, the greater the chance of exposure. A poisoner needs not only a toxin, but a moment when the victim drinks, and no one else is harmed in a way that reveals the plot too soon. Some poisons act quickly. They cause convulsions, vomiting, paralysis, collapse, delirium, or respiratory failure. Such a death might have been too obvious, too immediate, and too dangerous for the murderer. If Alexander had collapsed at once in front of companions, suspicion would have focused on the cup, the server, and the host. A slow poison would be more useful, but slow poisons bring their own difficulty. They may require repeated doses, and repeated dosing increases risk. They may produce symptoms that overlap with disease, but they may also fail to kill, leaving the victim alive and furious. The poisoner's ideal substance is one that looks like illness, cannot be detected, and kills reliably. Ancient poisoners may have dreamed of such a weapon, But history should not assume they possessed it merely because the story needs it. Modern attempts to identify the poison have suggested various possibilities, often with ingenuity but limited certainty. Some have pointed to white hellebore, a toxic plant that can cause severe gastrointestinal distress, weakness, slow heart rate, and prolonged illness. Others have considered arsenic or plant toxins. These proposals can be interesting because they try to connect symptoms with real substances rather than vague murder. Still, they depend on ancient reports that were not written as medical case notes. Was there vomiting? Was there diarrhea? Was there abdominal pain? Was paralysis present? Did fever dominate? Or was fever a literary simplification? Did he remain mentally clear until late? Or did the sources shape his decline to preserve dignity without reliable answers? Diagnosis becomes an exercise in controlled uncertainty. The fever is the greatest obstacle to many poison theories. Poisoning can produce fever in some circumstances, especially if it causes inflammation, organ damage, or secondary complications. But a persistent fever over many days more naturally suggests infection to many medical historians. Ancient sources consistently emphasize fever in the final illness, though the details vary. If fever is central and not merely a broad term for distress, then disease becomes strongly plausible. If the fever was exaggerated or misunderstood, poison becomes easier to defend. The entire debate depends on how much trust is placed in words transmitted through centuries of copying, summarizing, and interpretation. Another issue is Alexander's ability to function during parts of the illness. Some accounts suggest he continues to make sacrifices and issue instructions after the onset. A fast-acting poison would make this unlikely. A slower toxin might allow it, but so would many infections. The pattern of initial endurance followed by decline fits a man becoming progressively sicker from disease, dehydration, sepsis, or another natural condition. It does not exclude poison, but it removes the clean drama of a cup that kills by a single hidden stroke. The body's behaviour, as far as it can be reconstructed, resists simplicity. There is also a cultural problem. Ancient writers often use poison as a way to explain morally troubling deaths. Poison appears when a death seems politically convenient, when a powerful person dies unexpectedly, or when later factions need to attach guilt to an enemy. Sometimes the accusations are true, sometimes they are not. In Alexander's case, temptation is especially strong because his death is followed by such ferocious struggles among his successors. Every later dynasty has reason to remember the event in a way that serves its own legitimacy. A court rumour can harden into tradition. A tradition can become a historical claim. A historical claim can outlive the evidence that first produced it. The problem with ancient poisons, then, is not that poisoning is impossible. It is that the strongest versions of the theory often depend on details that are too neat, too symbolic, or too politically useful. A mysterious toxin carried from Macedonia by enemies of the king, administered by a cupbearer at a banquet, producing a sudden pain and a slow death just as succession tensions are rising, makes a powerful story. It gives the audience villains, method, setting, and meaning. But the historian must ask whether the story has been shaped precisely because it is powerful. What survives in the record suggests suspicion, not proof. If poison did play a role, it may have been less theatrical than legend imagines. It might have been a toxic medicine, a contaminated drink, an accidental overdose, or a substance given with intent but misunderstood in its effects. Ancient medicine and poison are not always cleanly separated. Treatments could be dangerous, remedies could weaken a patient, a desperate attempt to treat fever might worsen dehydration or organ stress. Such possibilities rarely satisfy the desire for a murderer. But they belong to the world of ancient illness. The line between care and harm could be thin, especially when theory outran knowledge. This leaves the poison theory suspended in a strange position. It cannot be dismissed as pure fantasy, because Alexander's political environment is genuinely dangerous, and ancient courts did know poison, but it cannot be accepted as fact, because the medical pattern is uncertain, the sources are divided, and many details show the fingerprints of legend. The poison, if it existed, has vanished beyond testing. It survives only as a shape in narrative, dark and useful, moving through the spaces where evidence has failed, and perhaps that is why it remains so compelling. Poison is intimate. It turns friendship, service, and celebration into threat. It makes the banquet table more dangerous than the battlefield. It suggests that Alexander, who faced kings and armies openly, was undone by something hidden in the rituals of trust. Yet the body in Babylon does not give up its answer. It burns with fever, weakens, falls silent, and leaves behind symptoms that point in more than one direction. The cup may have held death. It may have held only wine. The terror of the story is that after all the arguments, after all the named suspects and imagined substances, history still cannot look into that vessel and see clearly what was inside. Disease has none of the elegance of conspiracy. It does not flatter the imagination with secret meetings, hidden containers, bribed servants, or a cup passed at the perfect moment. It does not care whether a man is king of Macedonia, pharaoh of Egypt, lord of Asia, or the most feared commander alive. It moves through water, insects, food, breath, blood, waste, and the ordinary closeness of human beings. It thrives where armies gather, where cities crowd against rivers, where heat presses down on bodies already weakened by labour and stress. If poison makes Alexander's death feel meaningful, disease makes it feel older, colder, and perhaps more frightening. because it places the conqueror back inside the same fragile human world as everyone else. Babylon offers disease many doors. The city's greatness depends on water control, and water control in Mesopotamia means canals, channels, embankments, storage, irrigation, and slow-moving edges where life gathers thickly. Such environments can sustain agriculture and wealth, but they can also sustain fevers. Ancient people understand some places as unhealthy, even if they do not understand microbes or mosquito transmission. They know marshes can bring sickness. They know bad water can ruin a camp. They know heat can weaken men and that certain seasons seem to carry invisible danger. Alexander's final illness unfolds in a city where disease is not an exotic intruder. It is part of the environment, as real as mud brick and riverlight. Among modern explanations, typhoid fever has often attracted attention. It can produce prolonged fever, weakness, abdominal pain, delirium, intestinal symptoms, and a slow deterioration that may last days or weeks. It spreads through contaminated food and water, especially in crowded conditions with poor sanitation by modern standards. In an ancient city filled with soldiers, officials, servants, animals, waterways, and waste, such an infection is entirely plausible. Typhoid can also cause complications severe enough to kill even a strong adult. It does not require a murderer, only a pathogen moving through the systems that keep city life alive. The evidence remains incomplete, but the pattern of fever and gradual decline has made typhoid one of the more serious natural candidates. Yet typhoid is not certain. The ancient accounts do not preserve the kind of clinical detail a modern physician would need. They do not reliably describe rash, intestinal bleeding, stool patterns, pulse changes, or other signs that might strengthen or weaken the diagnosis. They describe fever, weakness, loss of speech, continued consciousness in some traditions, and death after a period of decline. Those clues are suggestive, but not decisive. Scholars still debate whether the symptoms fit typhoid better than other illnesses, and every confident answer must wrestle with the fact that the record is a literary and historical record, not a hospital chart. Malaria is another possibility because Mesopotamian conditions could support mosquito-borne fevers. Malaria can produce cycles of fever, chills, sweats, weakness, and potentially fatal complications, especially when the patient is already exhausted or exposed to a severe form. Alexander has travelled through many regions where malaria or malaria-like fevers may have existed. His body has known wet lowlands, river valleys, and marshy environments before, but malaria, too, is difficult to prove. The surviving accounts do not clearly describe the recurring fever cycles that would make the diagnosis stronger. A severe infection might not present neatly, and ancient observers might not record the pattern accurately, but the uncertainty remains. Malaria belongs among the possibilities, not as a settled verdict. Other infections have been proposed. Some have looked toward West Nile-like illness, which can be transmitted by mosquitoes and can cause fever, neurological symptoms, weakness, and in severe cases, death. This idea becomes especially intriguing when paired with later traditions about strange animal deaths or ominous signs, though such signs are themselves uncertain and may have been shaped by legend. Possibility is medically interesting, but historically fragile. It asks ancient narrative fragments to carry a great deal of diagnostic weight. What survives in the record suggests fever and decline, but it does not clearly preserve the neurological details needed for confidence. There are also broader categories that may be more honest than precise labels. Alexander may have died from an acute infectious fever that modern observers cannot identify from the surviving evidence. It may have been bacterial, viral, parasitic, or complicated by dehydration, alcohol, old injuries, or treatment. The desire to name one disease is understandable. A named disease feels like an answer. But ancient death often resists modern naming because the records were not created for that purpose. A fever in a text is not the same as a diagnosis. It is a doorway into possibilities. Still, natural disease has one great strength. As an explanation, it does not require the court to succeed at an extraordinary secret. It does not require a perfect poison, a flawless delivery, and decades of rumour preserving truth through political distortion. It requires only that Alexander, like every other person in the ancient world, be vulnerable to infection. His rank gives him better food, better shelter, more attendants, and access to physicians, but it does not give him immunity. Kings can command armies. They cannot command bacteria to halt. They cannot order mosquitoes away from water. They cannot see contamination in a cup or dish. They cannot negotiate with fever. The setting of an army makes this even more plausible. Alexander's court is not a small household. It is attached to a military world of camps, supplies, animals, kitchens, latrines, servants, and constant movement. Disease follows such worlds because they create networks of exposure. Men arrive from different regions carrying different illnesses. Supplies pass through many hands. Water sources vary. Food is stored, transported, and prepared under pressure. The king may dine apart, but he lives within the same biological web. The palace is grand, but the invisible traffic of disease does not respect ceremonial boundaries. Disease also explains why the decline could be slow enough to generate political suspense. A poisoner's plot may need secrecy, but an infection naturally creates uncertainty. The first day seems manageable. The second day is worrying. The third day may still allow hope. The fourth begins to change the mood. By the time speech weakens and strength fails, those around the bed have had time to imagine recovery and then slowly abandon it. This matches the psychological texture of the accounts. The court does not react to an instant killing. It watches a deterioration that becomes more frightening because it refuses to declare its meaning quickly. The weakness of the disease explanation is not that it is implausible, it is that it feels almost too ordinary for the scale of the event. This is not a historical weakness, but it is a narrative one. People remember Alexander as a figure who bends the world by will. To say that contaminated water or a mosquito helped end his life feels disproportionate, almost insulting to the legend. But history is filled with disproportion. Empires can turn on infections, armies can be stopped by dysentery, fever, hunger, and weather more effectively than by heroic resistance. The body does not ask whether its collapse is suitably grand. There may also have been more than one cause. This possibility is less tidy but more human. Alexander's body may have been weakened by years of wounds, alcohol, poor sleep, grief, and strain. A disease that a rested man might survive could become fatal in someone already depleted. Fever can bring dehydration. Dehydration can worsen organ stress. Ancient treatments might fail to replace fluids or might even intensify weakness. Pain could lead to more wine, sedatives, or remedies. Infection could trigger complications that ancient observers would simply fold into the general story of fever. No single explanation fully accounts for every detail because the real death may have been a convergence rather than a single blow. This convergence matters because it bridges the gap between disease and the other theories. A natural illness does not mean politics is irrelevant. A sick king can still be surrounded by men whose actions shape the outcome. Were treatments delayed, mishandled, or politicized? Did people hide the severity of his condition? Did rivals begin positioning themselves before he died? Did the court's fear and ambition affect who saw him, who advised him, and how his final wishes were understood? Disease can kill the body while politics decides what the death becomes. Betrayal need not be the cause of fever to become part of the story. In the end, the strongest case for disease lies in its quiet fit with the known world. Babylon is hot, wet, crowded, and ancient. Alexander is exhausted, wounded, grieving, and still pressing himself toward new campaigns. The illness is prolonged and feverish. The sources are uncertain but repeatedly point toward bodily decline rather than immediate destruction. Medical historians can argue over typhoid, malaria, viral infection, or another fever, but the larger frame remains. Natural causes are not only possible, they are deeply plausible. And yet plausibility does not close the mystery. Disease explains much, but not everything people want explained. It does not identify a villain, it does not satisfy the suspicion created by a court full of rivals, it does not erase the banquet, the rumours, the political timing, or the later accusations. It gives a likely path through the body, but the human mind keeps returning to the room around the body, to the cup, to the watchers, to the men who will soon divide the world. Disease may have killed Alexander, but suspicion survived because his death happened in a place where no illness could remain merely medical. In Babylon, even a fever becomes imperial history. The disease theory explains much, but it does not remove the older damage already written into Alexander's body. A fever does not fall upon an untouched man, it falls upon a king who has been wounded in battle, nearly killed in sieges, exhausted by marches, altered by grief, and surrounded by habits that make strength look like endless consumption. If the cause of death is natural, it may still not be simple. The final illness may be less like a single arrow and more like the last collapse of a wall that has been struck for years. From the outside, one sees the moment it falls. Hidden inside the stones are all the earlier cracks. Alexander's wounds are not decorative details in heroic biography. They are physical events, each with consequences that ancient sources may describe dramatically, but cannot fully measure. At the Granicus, he is nearly cut down in the press of cavalry combat. In later campaigns, he suffers injuries from missiles, blows, and close fighting. The Malian wound in India stands out because it appears to have been severe even by the standards of a man accustomed to danger. An arrow penetrates his torso during an assault that many of his own men consider recklessly brave. He is trapped inside the enemy position, bleeding, vulnerable, and for a time thought lost. Ancient accounts differ in details, but the broad event is clear enough Alexander survives a wound that could easily have killed him. Survival can be misleading. A wound may heal at the surface while leaving deeper problems. A puncture near the chest can damage lung tissue. Severe bleeding can weaken the body. Infection can come and go. Scar tissue can remain. Pain can become part of ordinary life. A ruler in Alexander's position cannot spend years recovering gently. He returns to command because the empire does not pause for convalescence. What survives in the record suggests that he often treats recovery as a temporary obstacle, not as a warning. This habit serves him well in legend. It serves him less well in medicine. His body is also subjected to climates and landscapes that change faster than any body prefers. Macedonia, Anatolia, Syria, Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Iranian plateau, Bactria, Sogdiana, the Hindu Kush, the Indus region. The Gedrosian desert each brings different demands. Cold, altitude, dry heat, wet heat, unfamiliar food, new water sources, insects, long distances, interrupted sleep, and the pressure of command all accumulate. Modern readers sometimes imagine ancient campaigns as lines on a map, but the human reality is abrasion, sand in the eyes, rotting supplies, horses collapsing, men with stomach sickness, wounds reopened by movement, dust in the throat, nights too cold for comfort and days too hot for judgment. Alexander experiences much of this from the best position available, but the best position in an ancient army is still harsh by ordinary standards. Alcohol adds another layer, though it should not be turned into a simple moral explanation. Alexander's drinking belongs to the aristocratic culture around him. Banquets are political spaces, and heavy drinking can signal endurance, generosity, equality among warriors, or masculine force. In Macedonian society, the cup is not only pleasure, it is performance, yet the body does not care whether excess is socially admired. Heavy drinking can inflame the stomach, disturb sleep, weaken resilience, and contribute to dangerous medical crises. It can worsen dehydration in a hot climate. It can cloud judgment at precisely the moments when rest would be wiser than another night of royal display. The killing of Cletus shows the political and emotional danger of alcohol, but it also shows something about Alexander's inner strain. A drunken quarrel becomes a fatal confrontation because the court is a place where memory, pride, fear, and resentment sit close to the surface. Cletus represents the old Macedonian world, the hard-speaking companion who can remind the king of his father, his army, and his dependence on men who fought before Asia began to bow. Alexander, increasingly surrounded by imperial ceremony and eastern grandeur, reacts with catastrophic rage. The incident does not directly explain the final fever, but it reveals a man under pressure, a man whose drinking can open doors he cannot close. After Hephaestion's death, that pressure deepens. Grief in a private man is painful. Grief in Alexander becomes imperial weather. It changes the tone of the court. It leads to grand honours, anger at physicians, mourning that reaches beyond personal loss into public command. Hephaestion had been woven into Alexander's emotional and political life more tightly than any ordinary companion. His absence leaves a space that cannot be filled by new plans. Though Alexander tries to move toward new plans anyway, scholars still debate the exact nature and scale of their bond, and ancient sources frame it through their own assumptions. But the intensity of Alexander's mourning is difficult to dismiss. Grief weakens people in ways that are not always visible. It can make sleep shallow, appetite irregular, anger quicker, and judgment more brittle. It can drive a person toward rituals of excess because excess feels, briefly, like control. A king surrounded by flatterers, obligations, and fear may have fewer chances than an ordinary man to collapse honestly. Alexander must continue being Alexander, even when the role becomes heavier than the body beneath it. The evidence remains incomplete. But it is reasonable to imagine that by Babylon he is not merely tired, he is depleted. The stress of kingship itself becomes part of the medical story. Alexander is not resting in Babylon as a retired conqueror. He's preparing another campaign. He's managing the integration of elites. He's dealing with Macedonian resentment, Persian expectations, administrative problems, military logistics, and the unresolved question of what kind of empire he is building. His army has already resisted him in India. His veterans have already shown that their loyalty has limits. His officers have their own power bases. His mother Olympias remains a fierce and destabilizing presence in Macedonian politics. Antipater remains powerful in Europe. The royal family is not secure. Every plan has enemies. Every decision creates winners and losers. No single illness exists outside this environment of constant strain. Under such conditions, even an ordinary infection can become extraordinary. A fever that begins after a banquet may not be caused by the banquet, but the banquet may worsen the body's response. Alcohol can reduce resilience. Heat can intensify dehydration. Old injuries can lower reserves. Poor sleep can weaken resistance. Stress can impair recovery. Ancient treatment may help in some cases and harm in others. A physician might restrict or prescribe fluids according to theory rather than need. A bath might comfort or exhaust. A purge might be intended to rebalance the body but leave it weaker. The final illness may therefore be a web of causes, not a single clean line. This is why the opposition between poison and disease can be too narrow. The real body does not divide itself according to later theories. It receives everything at once: pathogens, toxins, fatigue, injury, alcohol, grief, treatment, climate, and fear. If Alexander died of typhoid, malaria, or another infection, his previous condition may have shaped the severity. If he was poisoned, his weakened body may have made him less able to survive it. If he suffered an acute internal condition, years of strain may have prepared the way. No single explanation fully accounts for every detail because human death often refuses the neatness that historical debate desires. There is a bitter irony here. Alexander's greatest political asset is the appearance of inexhaustibility. He has taught men to believe that he can cross anything, endure anything, return from anything. That belief makes him powerful, but it may also trap him. A ruler known for endurance must keep enduring. He cannot easily admit weakness, cannot easily stop moving, cannot easily become ordinary. Each recovery from wounds and hardships strengthens the myth, while perhaps weakening the man. By Babylon, the myth and the body have moved dangerously far apart. When the fever finally takes hold, the court sees the myth fail before the body does. Alexander still looks like the king. The empire still speaks in his name. Orders still carry his authority. Soldiers still wait for his appearance. But inside, the reserves may already be gone. The man who has survived spears, arrows, deserts, grief, and his own relentless appetite for the next horizon has reached a place where willpower cannot command the organs, the blood, the breath, or the unseen workings of disease. This does not make his death less mysterious. It makes it more human. Poison offers a single enemy. Disease offers an invisible one. Exhaustion offers something even harder to face, the possibility that Alexander's life itself, in all its brilliance and violence, helped prepare his death. Babylon may have supplied the fever. A rival may have supplied suspicion. But the years before, Babylon supplied the weakness no one wanted to see. The conqueror did not arrive at his final chamber as an untouched hero, struck down by one sudden force. He arrived as a man already carrying the cost of every victory. Betrayal does not always need a blade, and it does not always need poison. Sometimes it lives in hesitation, in silence, in the careful delay of men who understand that a dying king may soon become more useful as a memory than as a commander. Around Alexander's final bed, the word betrayal must be handled carefully. There is no secure evidence that his companions stood by and knowingly let him die when they could have saved him. There is no clear proof that a faction arranged the illness or blocked a cure, yet the political world surrounding his decline is so charged, so fragile, and so full of future violence that suspicion naturally widens beyond the cup. Even if no one murders Alexander, the crisis exposes how quickly loyalty can bend under the weight of succession. The men nearest him are not simple villains waiting for the right hour. Many have fought beside him for years. They have shared danger, hunger, wounds, triumph, and the strange intimacy that grows among commanders who survive too much together. Some may love him genuinely, some may fear him deeply. Most depend on him, but dependence is not the same as innocence. Alexander's court is a place where friendship and ambition are intertwined so tightly that one cannot always be separated from the other. A companion can mourn the king and calculate the future in the same breath. Ancient politics rarely allows the luxury of pure emotion. Perdiccas stands close to the centre of the aftermath, and that alone makes him important. He is one of Alexander's senior commanders, trusted enough to receive authority in the chaotic hours after the king's death. Some traditions suggest Alexander gives him the royal signet ring near the end, though scholars still debate the meaning and reliability of that scene. The ring, if given, may signal temporary authority, personal trust, or merely the practical need for someone to handle affairs while the king is incapacitated. But after Alexander dies, symbols become weapons. A ring can be interpreted as a mandate. A gesture can become a claim. A moment beside a sickbed can be turned into the foundation of power. Perdiccas may not betray Alexander in the sense of causing his death, but he benefits from proximity to it. This is the kind of fact that makes history uncomfortable. In a crisis, someone must take control. The person who takes control can later appear opportunistic, even if action was necessary. Perdiccas helps manage the immediate succession debate, and for a time he emerges as one of the most powerful men in the empire. That does not make him a murderer. It does show how the final illness creates openings that ambitious men cannot ignore. The evidence remains incomplete, but the pattern of the aftermath suggests that those closest to Alexander understand very quickly that the empire is about to be divided by interpretation as much as by force. Other commanders also wait in the shadow of the sick room: Ptolemy, Seleucus, Antigonus, Lysimachus, Leonatus, Craterus, and others belong to the world that Alexander has made. Some are present, some absent, some near the political centre, some positioned elsewhere, but all are drawn into the consequences. These men will later become rulers, founders of dynasties, enemies, allies, and betrayers of one another. Their later careers make it tempting to read their ambition backward into the death chamber. That temptation must be resisted, but not ignored. They did become the men who broke the empire apart. Whether they already imagined that future while Alexander was still breathing is unknowable, yet the possibility hangs over every account of the final days. The succession problem is the deepest form of betrayal because it reveals what Alexander has not done. He has not left a clear adult heir. His half-brother Aridaeus, later known as Philip III, is alive but considered mentally impaired or politically limited in ways the sources describe through hostile and uncertain language. Roxana, Alexander's Bactrian wife, is pregnant, but an unborn child is not commander. Other royal women carry claims, rivalries, and dangers. The Macedonian army has a voice, but not a calm one. The empire has many elites, but no shared mechanism for peaceful transfer. Alexander has conquered the Persian throne, but he has not built a succession strong enough to survive his absence. In this sense, the first betrayal may be structural. The empire has been asked to depend on one man without being given a reliable way to continue without him. This does not mean Alexander is careless in a simple way. Naming a successor while he is alive could have been dangerous. A powerful heir or deputy might become a rival. A chosen general might provoke jealousy among the others. A child heir might still need a regent, and regents in royal courts often become kingmakers or kings in all but name. Alexander may have assumed he had more time. He may have expected sons to grow into the role. He may have believed his companions would hold the empire together because loyalty to him would outlast his breath. No single explanation fully accounts for the absence of a clear plan, but the result is unmistakable. His silence at the end leaves room for everyone else's voice. The army's role makes the situation even more unstable. Macedonian kingship has always depended on the relationship between king, nobles, and army. The soldiers are not modern subjects passively waiting for legal succession. They can acclaim, resist, and demand. During the final crisis, the infantry and cavalry, the rank and file and the senior companions, do not necessarily want the same thing. Some favour Aradeus because he is present, male and royal. Others prefer waiting for Roxana's child. If the child is a boy, some commanders want a regency that keeps power in their hands. Every option contains danger. A living adult king with limited capacity can be manipulated. An unborn heir can be used, delayed, or eliminated. A regent can become too powerful. A divided monarchy can become a temporary bandage over a fatal wound. Betrayal, then, may be less an event than an atmosphere. It is present in the way men begin to think beyond Alexander before he is fully gone. It is present in the careful management of access to the king. It is present in the transformation of grief into position. It is present in the speed with which former companions become guardians of their own futures. This is not necessarily moral failure in the ordinary sense. Ancient power punishes naivety. A general who does not prepare may die. A noble who trusts too long may be removed. In such a world, survival itself can look like betrayal. There is also the question of medical decision-making. If Alexander's illness is natural, could better care have saved him? The answer is impossible to know. Ancient physicians lack antibiotics, intravenous fluids, modern surgery, laboratory tests, and accurate infectious disease theory. If he had typhoid, severe malaria, sepsis, or another deadly illness, even sincere care may have failed. But in a court environment, medicine can be politicized. Which physician is trusted? Which remedy is chosen? Who approves treatment? Who is blamed if the king worsens? Hephaestion's physician had reportedly paid with his life after failing to save him. That memory must have haunted any doctor near Alexander. Fear can make physicians cautious, aggressive, or desperate. The evidence remains incomplete, and there is no way to reconstruct the treatment hour by hour. Still, the bedside is not free from politics simply because the patient is sick. The silence surrounding his final wishes becomes another wound. A dying Alexander who cannot speak leaves his companions to speak for him. Some may do so honestly, others may not. A gesture, a ring, a look, a half-heard word, a fading instruction can be reshaped by men who need authority. When a king's last command is unclear, those who report it gain enormous power. Later tradition preserves memorable phrases, but memorable phrases are often the most suspicious. The empire after Alexander does not behave as if guided by a clear testament. It behaves as if everyone is improvising under pressure while claiming loyalty to a man who can no longer contradict them. In this sense, betrayal without a knife may be the most historically convincing form of betrayal. It does not require a murderer. It requires only human beings placed around collapsing power. It requires fear of losing status, fear of rivals, fear of the army, fear of Macedon, fear of Persian elites, fear of royal women, fear of being too late. It requires men who have been trained by years of conquest to seize opportunity before someone else does. Alexander created many extraordinary commanders. His death releases them from the one command they all had to obey. The tragedy is that loyalty to Alexander and betrayal of his empire can exist together. A general may sincerely revere him and still take Egypt, Babylon, Asia Minor, or Syria when the chance appears. A companion may mourn the dead king and still use his name as a banner in war. A regent may claim to preserve the royal house while weakening it. A soldier may demand a legitimate king while helping create a settlement that cannot last. The language of loyalty survives because Alexander's name remains powerful. The practice of loyalty collapses because the living interests of powerful men move faster than reverence for the dead. So the mystery widens. If the question is only whether someone poisoned Alexander, the answer may remain forever uncertain. But if the question is whether betrayal surrounds his death, the answer is easier and darker. Betrayal surrounds it because the empire is already full of men who cannot afford innocence. It surrounds it because a dying king becomes a political object before he becomes a corpse. It surrounds it because no one in Babylon can separate the fate of Alexander's body from the fate of their own ambitions. The fever may have been natural, the poison may be legend, but the betrayal is visible in what follows the swift conversion of companionship into rivalry, of royal service into personal power, of grief into calculation, and of one man's unfinished world into a battlefield of heirs who are not truly heirs at all. After death, Alexander's body becomes almost as mysterious as his illness. A living king can command, frighten, reward, and speak. A dead king can no longer do any of these things, yet in some ways his power becomes even more dangerous. His corpse is not merely a body to be mourned. It is a political object, a sacred object, a dynastic object, and eventually a legendary object. Whoever controls the body controls a piece of Alexander's authority. Whoever buries him can claim closeness to his memory. Whoever moves him can reshape the geography of his legacy. And before all of that begins, there is the strange tradition that his body does not decay in the ordinary way. The story is famous because it seems to offer a clue. Ancient accounts, especially later ones, suggest that after Alexander dies, his body remains uncorrupted for several days, even in the heat of Babylon. Some interpret this as a sign of divinity. Others, much later, have wondered whether it points to a medical condition in which he may have appeared dead before he truly was, or whether paralysis and a very low state of consciousness may have been mistaken for death. These ideas are dramatic, and they show how strongly the mystery still pulls at the imagination, yet the evidence remains incomplete, and caution is necessary. Ancient writers often treat unusual preservation as a sign that a great person is favoured by the gods, or that the body itself carries sacred meaning. A corpse that does not decay becomes proof that the dead man was not ordinary. In Alexander's case, that message was almost too useful to avoid. The practical reality of death in Babylon is harsh. heat accelerates decay. A royal corpse must be washed, prepared, guarded, and protected from both physical corruption and political chaos. Embalming techniques were known in Egypt, and Alexander's eventual burial traditions become connected with Egyptian methods, but the earliest hours and days after death are not fully clear. The body may have been treated with substances that slowed decomposition. It may have been kept in conditions better than ordinary bodies. Reports of delayed decay may have been exaggerated by admirers, or shaped by the later need to present Alexander as more than human. No single explanation fully accounts for the tradition, because the tradition is not a neutral medical observation. It's a story told around a corpse that everyone already understands as historically explosive. One modern speculation suggests that Alexander may have suffered from a neurological disorder causing paralysis, perhaps leaving him unable to move or speak while still alive, and that his apparent delayed decay could reflect premature declaration of death. This idea is unsettling because it turns the final chamber into something almost unbearable, not a dead king awaiting burial, but a living man trapped inside a body no one can read. It has attracted attention for its dramatic force. But it remains highly speculative. The ancient evidence does not securely support it. There are no reliable clinical details sufficient to prove such a condition, and the delayed decomposition tradition itself may be symbolic or exaggerated. Scholars still debate the medical possibilities, but most cautious interpretations avoid building too much on a story that may have grown in the soil of legend. Another possibility is simpler. Alexander's body may not have remained untouched by decay as long as later writers suggest. The claim may have served religious and political purposes. Great kings often receive signs after death. Their births are surrounded by omens, their victories by divine favour, their deaths by wonders. Alexander had already cultivated or accepted forms of extraordinary status during his life. He had visited the Oracle of Ammon in Egypt, and later traditions connected him with divine sonship. Some Greek and Macedonian companions resisted excessive divine honours, but across the empire, ideas of sacred kingship varied widely. In Egypt and Babylon, kingship had long been entangled with the divine order. A body that resists corruption fits neatly into this world of meaning. Yet even if the non-decaying body is legend, it reveals something true about the atmosphere after his death. People did not know how to make Alexander ordinary. His corpse could not simply be treated as the remains of a young Macedonian noble. It belonged to a man whose life had overturned empires and whose image already pressed against the boundaries of myth. The body lying in Babylon carried too much history. Even the natural processes of death seemed to later memory, as if they should hesitate before touching him. The delay before burial adds to the sense of unease. Royal funerals require planning, but Alexander's situation is extreme. Where should he be buried? Macedonia, the homeland of his dynasty, would be an obvious choice for a traditional Argead king. Egypt, where he had founded Alexandria and been linked with divine kingship, offered another powerful possibility. Babylon itself, where he died and where he had planned future imperial rule, might also have held symbolic value. The question is not only ceremonial, it is political. A tomb can become a centre of legitimacy. A dead king in one territory can strengthen the ruler who guards him. The corpse becomes a treasure more valuable than gold because it contains memory, loyalty, and sacred prestige. The eventual journey of Alexander's body becomes one of the most extraordinary afterlives in ancient history. His corpse is prepared for transport in a magnificent funeral carriage, described by ancient writers with rich detail, though again the descriptions may include exaggeration. The procession is meant to carry him toward Macedonia, but the body is intercepted and taken to Egypt by Ptolemy. This act is not merely theft, if theft is the right word for something so grand and political. It is a declaration. Ptolemy understands that possession of Alexander's remains will help anchor his own authority in Egypt. He cannot claim to be Alexander by blood, but he can become guardian of Alexander's body and memory. In a world where legitimacy is being improvised, that matters enormously. This later movement casts a shadow backward onto the first days after death. Even before the corpse leaves Babylon, its future is contested because the empire itself is contested. The body is silent, but men speak through it. They use it to claim continuity. They use it to suggest divine favour. They use it to draw soldiers, settlers, priests, and subjects into new arrangements of power. Alexander's remains become a second empire, smaller than the first but perhaps more durable. His living empire fractures within years. His dead image travels across centuries. The claim that the body did not decay also intersects with the poison debate. Some later readers have argued that certain poisons might delay decomposition, while others have suggested that the report points away from disease. These arguments are fragile. Decomposition depends on many factors: temperature, preparation, timing, environment, treatment of the body, and the accuracy of observers. Ancient descriptions are rarely precise enough to serve as forensic evidence. A story about a preserved corpse cannot bear the full weight of diagnosing a death. It is better understood as part of the struggle to interpret Alexander after he is gone. Still, the image remains powerful. The generals may be arguing, and the army may be anxious. The royal family may already be entering danger. But somewhere inside the guarded spaces of Babylon lies the body that everyone needs, and no one can restore. If it shows little decay, or if people believe it does, the effect is the same. Alexander seems suspended between mortality and legend. The man is dead, yet not entirely surrendered to death. His flesh becomes a sign people read according to their hopes and fears. To some, it proves divinity. To others, murder. To others, the special destiny of a king who changed the earth. To cautious history, it proves mostly that grief and power can transform a corpse into a text. The deeper strangeness is that Alexander's body begins to travel the path his living plans never complete. He had intended to send armies and fleets outward from Babylon. Instead, his corpse becomes the thing that moves. It is prepared, guarded, transported, seized, displayed, and eventually housed in a tomb that later rulers will visit. The dead king becomes a destination. Romans centuries later will seek his tomb in Alexandria, as if approaching a relic of world conquest. The body that once could not remain still in life becomes fixed in death, yet its meaning keeps moving through time. The tradition of delayed decay therefore belongs not only to medicine, but to memory. It shows the refusal of the ancient world to let Alexander's death be simple. Fever is too plain. Poison is more dramatic, but still human. A body untouched by decay suggests that even nature pauses. Whether that pause truly happened is uncertain. What matters is that people needed to believe something about his body because the ordinary facts were unbearable. He had conquered too much, too quickly, too young, and then vanished into silence. The corpse that would not decay becomes a final way of saying that Alexander remains unfinished. And perhaps that is the most haunting part. A decaying body confirms closure. It tells the living that the person has passed fully into the realm of the dead. Alexander's body, in tradition, refuses that closure just as his empire refuses a peaceful succession. Everything about him remains unsettled because of death. Final wish, rightful heir, burial place, divine status, historical meaning. The body in Babylon does not end the mystery. It deepens it. The fever has stopped. The breath has ended. The king is gone, and yet the world around him cannot let him become merely dead. The moment Alexander dies, the empire does not fall with a crash. It holds its breath. That pause is almost more frightening than open violence, because everyone understands that the old order is gone, but no one yet knows what the new order will dare to call itself. The palace in Babylon becomes a chamber of suspended disaster. The king is dead. The body remains. The soldiers wait. The commanders gather. The royal women are absent or vulnerable. The unborn child is still only a possibility. The empire, which yesterday had one voice, now has too many. For years, Alexander's authority has allowed contradictions to exist without being resolved. Macedonian veterans and Persian nobles can serve the same king because he commands them both. Greek cities can resent Macedonian power while still fearing the army that enforces it. Satraps can govern vast provinces because they govern in his name. Officers can hate one another, but remain within the same structure because Alexander stands above them, once he is dead. All those unresolved tensions rise at once. They do not need to be invented. They have been waiting inside the empire like cracks hidden beneath painted plaster. The first problem is brutally simple. Who as King Alexander has no adult legitimate son ready to take command? Roxana, his wife, is pregnant, and if the child is male, he can inherit the Argead bloodline. But an unborn child cannot appear before the army, cannot ride at the head of cavalry, cannot issue orders, cannot satisfy men who want a visible king. Alexander's half-brother Aridaeus is alive, and royal blood matters deeply, but ancient sources present him as mentally limited. Though the descriptions are shaped by political hostility and may not be fully reliable, what survives in the record suggests that he is not viewed as capable of ruling independently. He can be king in name, but someone else will wield the power. This opens the door to regency, and regency is one of the most dangerous words in monarchy. A regent claims to guard the throne for someone else. In practice, he holds armies, seals, orders, treasure, and access. He can promote friends, isolate rivals, interpret the king's will, and decide who is loyal. If the king is a child or a vulnerable adult, the regent may become the real centre of government. Every ambitious commander understands this. Every rival fears it. A regency meant to preserve unity can become the first battlefield of the succession. The debate after Alexander's death reveals the different interests of the army and elite commanders. The infantry, especially the Macedonian rank and file, may favour Aridaeus because he is physically present and royal. For soldiers who have followed Alexander far from home, the idea of waiting for the birth of a child by a Bactrian wife may feel uncertain, foreign, or too easily manipulated by the senior officers. The cavalry commanders and high companions may prefer a solution that allows them to control affairs through a regency, especially if Roxana's unborn child proves male. The dispute is not simply about blood, it is about who will hold power during uncertainty. The result is compromise, but not peace. Aridaeus becomes Philip III, a king with the name of Alexander's father but without his father's force. Roxana's child, when born male, becomes Alexander IV, the posthumous son of the conqueror. Two kings now exist where one had ruled. One is an adult whose capacity is doubted and controlled. The other is an infant whose life depends on men who may find him useful until he becomes inconvenient. This arrangement appears to solve the immediate crisis. But it does not answer the deeper question. The empire now has royal names, but authority has begun to slip into the hands of generals. The settlement that follows divides commands and satrapies among powerful men. It does not yet openly declare the empire broken. The language remains one of unity, guardianship, continuity, loyalty to the royal house. This matters because no commander can immediately claim to be Alexander's equal. His name is still too large. His soldiers still remember him too vividly. His family still carries dynastic legitimacy. To seize kingship outright would be dangerous. It is safer, at first. To rule in the name of the dead man's heirs while building an independent base. The empire is not destroyed in one blow, it is hollowed out by practical arrangements that pretend to be temporary. Perdiccas emerges with central authority, but central authority after Alexander is fragile. He may hold the royal ring or claim the strongest position in the settlement, but he does not hold Alexander's personal charisma. He has to command men who consider themselves nearly as equals, men who have led armies, governed provinces, and tasted power. They obey as long as obedience serves them, or as long as disobedience is too dangerous. That is not the same as loyalty. The empire has moved from a world of personal kingship into a world of armed negotiation. Ptolemy receives Egypt, and this becomes one of the most consequential assignments in the ancient world. Egypt is rich, defensible, and symbolically powerful. Its Nile Valley can sustain a kingdom, its priesthoods can legitimize rulers, its location connects the eastern Mediterranean with Africa and the Red Sea. Ptolemy is cautious, intelligent, and patient enough to understand that survival may matter more than claiming everything. By taking Egypt, and later securing Alexander's body, he begins to build something that will outlast many louder ambitions. The evidence remains incomplete regarding every private calculation, but his actions suggest a man who sees the future not as one empire to inherit, but as a world of territories to hold. Other commanders also receive or retain crucial regions. Seleucus will eventually rise in the east, Antigonus will become a towering figure in Asia, Lysimachus will carve power in Thrace, Cassander will dominate Macedonia. These later outcomes are not all visible in the first stunned hours after Alexander's death, but the seeds are present. Each satrapy can become a kingdom if central authority weakens. Each army can become a dynastic instrument. Each treasury can fund independence. The empire's geography begins to teach its commanders how to become kings. Meanwhile, the royal family becomes trapped inside the machinery of ambition. Roxana gives birth to Alexander IV, but motherhood to the conqueror's son is not safety. It makes her central and endangered. Olympias, Alexander's mother, remains a formidable figure in Macedonian politics, capable of inspiring loyalty and fear, but her force cannot restore the empire's unity. Philip III and his wife Eurydice become involved in the brutal struggles of legitimacy and control, the Argead bloodline, which should have been the empire's anchor, becomes a set of pieces moved by others. The people with the strongest hereditary claims often have the least practical power. This is one of the bitter consequences of Alexander's sudden death. His family does not inherit his empire in any meaningful sense. His generals inherit the ability to speak in his name. They can protect the kings, escort them, control them, marry around them, use their images, and eventually remove them. The royal house becomes sacred enough to be useful and vulnerable enough to be destroyed. No single explanation fully accounts for the cruelty that follows. But the logic of power is clear. As long as Alexander's heirs live, they provide legitimacy. As they grow older, they become threats to those who have built power in their shadow. The army also discovers its own dangerous strength. In the immediate aftermath, soldiers can force decisions, reject elite plans, and demand recognition of their preferred king. But armies are not stable political institutions. They can be persuaded, bribed, divided, exhausted, moved, and used by commanders. The soldiers who file past Alexander's sickbed as loyal mourners soon become the military base for rival ambitions. Their grief does not prevent civil war. In some ways, it fuels it. Because every faction claims to defend the true legacy of the dead king. Babylon itself, the city where Alexander planned to organize the next stage of empire, becomes the birthplace of division. This is the great reversal. He had intended Babylon to be a center from which power would move outward under his command. Instead, after his death, power begins to scatter outward from Babylon into the hands of men who will never again accept a single master for long. The city that was supposed to launch another campaign becomes the place where the future stops being singular. For a brief time, the forms of unity remain visible. There are still kings named in official acts. There are still regents and councils. There are still commands issued in the name of the royal house. But beneath these forms, the emotional truth has changed. Alexander's companions have crossed an invisible line. They have learned that the empire can continue without Alexander's living voice, but only by becoming something else. Every solution creates a new rivalry. Every compromise postpones violence rather than preventing it. Every man who gains a province gains a reason not to surrender it. The death mystery therefore expands into a political mystery. How can a world conquered so quickly be inherited at all? The answer, slowly and bloodily, is that it cannot be inherited whole. It can only be contested, divided, renamed, and remembered. In Babylon, the first decisions are made under the shadow of the body. Men speak of continuity because they must. They invoke Alexander because his name still binds the army's imagination. But outside the palace, beyond the heat and canals and old temple walls, the empire is already beginning to loosen. The breath Alexander held for it has ended. The breath the empire holds after him cannot last. After Alexander's death, the struggle is not only for provinces, armies, treasure, and royal heirs, it is also for the story. Whoever can explain Alexander can use him. Whoever can claim to understand his final wishes, his divine favour, his moral meaning, or his true enemies gains a weapon that is quieter than cavalry but often just as powerful. The dead king becomes a field of battle, and the men who survive him quickly learn that memory can be occupied like a city. His death is rewritten because the world he leaves behind needs him to mean different things at different moments, and no living Alexander remains to correct the record. The earliest memories of his final illness are already shaped by danger. In the immediate aftermath, no account can be politically innocent. If the death is described as natural, then those who take power afterward may appear less guilty. If it is described as murder, then blame can be aimed at rivals. If Alexander is portrayed as calm and deliberate at the end, then whatever arrangements follow can be dressed as obedience to his will. If he is portrayed as silent and helpless, then the chaos afterward seems unavoidable. Each version serves someone. The evidence remains incomplete partly because time has damaged the record, but also because the record was never born in neutral air. Ancient historians who write about Alexander do so from sources now mostly lost. They inherit earlier accounts by men who knew him, served him, opposed him, admired him, or wrote under the influence of those who did. Ptolemy, Aristobulus, Nearchus, Clitarchus, and others stand behind later narratives like figures behind a curtain. Some had first-hand experience. Some shaped memories to defend themselves or their patrons. Ptolemy, for example. Later becomes king in Egypt and has every reason to present his own role in the age of Alexander as honourable and measured. That does not make his testimony worthless, but it reminds us that memory written by successful men is rarely free from self-protection. As generations pass, Alexander becomes larger and more flexible. To Macedonian veterans, he can be remembered as the heroic king who led them to wealth and glory, even if many had cursed his endless marches while he lived. To Greek moralists, he can become a warning about ambition, fortune, drunkenness, anger, and the instability of human greatness. To rulers of the Hellenistic kingdoms, he becomes an ancestor of legitimacy, not always by blood, but by imitation. To Egyptian subjects of the Ptolemies, his body in Alexandria anchors a new dynasty in the sacred landscape of kingship. To later Romans, he becomes the measuring rod of conquest, the young thunderbolt against whom generals and emperors compare themselves uneasily. Each world receives a different Alexander. His death changes along with these needs. For those who want him heroic, poison is attractive because it preserves his undefeated aura. He does not lose to age, strategic failure, rebellion, or weakness. He is stolen. For those who want him morally instructive, the banquet matters because it suggests excess. A man who conquered others could not conquer appetite, anger, or pride. For those who want him divine, the body that does not decay matters because it suggests that nature itself recognizes him. For those who want him human, the fever matters because it strips away grandeur and leaves a young man dying in a hot city, as vulnerable as any soldier in his army. None of these portraits is entirely invented, but each selects what it needs. The successor kings have particular reasons to handle Alexander's memory carefully. None of them can simply erase him. Their authority comes, in part, from having served under him. They fight one another while claiming continuity with his achievement. They found dynasties that rule over fragments of his empire, but those fragments gain prestige from the larger whole he once held. Coins, monuments, city foundations, royal titles, court ceremonies, and genealogical claims all draw energy from his name. Alexander becomes a resource, and like all valuable resources, he is controlled, displayed, and contested. Ptolemy's seizure of the body is the clearest example. By bringing Alexander's remains to Egypt, he does more than secure a corpse. He creates a centre of memory. Alexandria, the city Alexander founded, becomes the place where the dead conqueror can be visited, honoured, and politically absorbed into the Ptolemaic world. Later rulers can associate themselves with the tomb. Visitors can experience the physical presence of the man whose conquest made the Hellenistic age possible. The body becomes a monument that silently supports a dynasty. In that context, stories about the body's preservation, divine signs, and special destiny are not harmless curiosities. They strengthen the sacred atmosphere around possession. Meanwhile, other traditions darken different enemies. Antipater's family becomes a natural target for poisoning stories, because later politics makes them suspect. Cassandra's eventual hostility toward Alexander's line, including the destruction of Alexander's surviving heir, casts a long shadow backward. When people know that a man later benefits from the ruin of a royal house, they are tempted to imagine that his family's guilt began earlier. This backward reading may be emotionally satisfying, but it's historically dangerous. The evidence for poisoning remains uncertain, and later crimes do not automatically prove earlier ones. Still, ancient memory often works by moral pattern rather than strict proof. A family that appears villainous later becomes easier to accuse before. The same process affects Alexander's own character. Writers who admire him emphasize courage, vision, generosity, and extraordinary energy. Writers who criticize him emphasize cruelty, drunkenness, arrogance, and the corruption of success. Both Alexanders are recognizable in the evidence. He could be magnificently brave and brutally violent. He could reward loyalty and destroy those he suspected. He could respect local traditions and annihilate resisting cities. He could dream of joining peoples and still rule through fear. The problem is not that one version is true and the other false. The problem is that later storytelling often chooses one Alexander and forces the death to match him. If Alexander is the noble hero, death by betrayal fits. If he is the overreaching tyrant, death after drinking fits. If he is the chosen son of gods, incorruptible flesh fits. If he is a human being crushed by the conditions of his own life, disease and exhaustion fit, the cause of death becomes a mirror held up to the interpreter. This is why the mystery has lasted so long. It is not only because the sources are incomplete, it is because each possible answer carries a different moral world. The popular legends that grow around Alexander take this even further. In later centuries, the Alexander romance transforms him into a traveller of marvels, an explorer of the edges of the earth, a seeker beneath the sea and near the heavens, a figure who belongs as much to imagination as to history. In such traditions, his death becomes part of a grand pattern of wonder. Historical Babylon gives way to symbolic Babylon. Medical uncertainty gives way to destiny. The king becomes a vessel for stories about human ambition, the boundaries of knowledge, and the impossibility of escaping mortality. These legends are not reliable guides to the final illness, but they show how powerfully Alexander's life exceeded the political facts of his age. Even sober historical accounts cannot entirely escape the pull of drama. A young conqueror dying at 32 invites structure. The rise is too steep, the fall too sudden, the aftermath too violent. Writers naturally search for meaning. They arrange events so that the end seems foreshadowed by earlier signs: the murder of Clytus, the adoption of Persian customs, the grief of Hephaestion, the warnings of Babylonian priests, the banquet, the fever, the silence. Some of these events are real. Some are uncertain, but when placed in sequence, they create the feeling of inevitability. History becomes tragedy. The danger is that tragedy can make uncertain details feel necessary. This does not mean all later writing should be dismissed. Ancient authors preserve invaluable fragments of lost testimony. Without them, the final days would be almost invisible. But they must be read with the awareness that Alexander's death was never just a medical event to them. It was a moral lesson, a political turning point, a dynastic problem, and a literary climax. Their choices of emphasis matter. Their silences matter. Their contradictions matter. The historian must listen not only to what they say, but to why a particular version might have survived. The rewriting of Alexander's death continues into the modern world. Modern medicine proposes diagnoses. Modern historians reconstruct court politics. Novelists and filmmakers return to poison, betrayal, and doomed greatness. Each age finds the Alexander it needs. A world fascinated by conspiracy sees murder. A world trained in epidemiology sees infection. A world interested in trauma sees exhaustion and accumulated injury. A world suspicious of empire sees the collapse of a violent project held together by one charismatic commander. The mystery adapts because the evidence leaves room for adaptation. And so the death in Babylon remains unstable, not because nothing is known, but because what is known never quite fixes the meaning. Alexander becomes ill, he declines over days, he dies young, his empire enters crisis, his body becomes politically valuable. Accusations of poison circulate but remain unproven, disease is plausible but not certain. Betrayal surrounds the aftermath even if it did not cause the fever. These are the hard stones of the story. Around them, memory builds palaces. Tombs, accusations, warnings, and myths. In the end, power rewrites Alexander's death because power cannot leave such a death alone. Too much depends on it. Too many men need to stand near the dead king without appearing to have pushed him. Too many dynasties need his greatness without inheriting his blood. Too many writers need his life to teach a lesson. The fever in Babylon ends one man's life, but the struggle over its meaning begins almost immediately and never truly stops. Alexander dies once. His death is retold endlessly. Each retelling revealing not only something about him, but something about the people who cannot stop trying to possess him. The mystery that survives is not a locked room with one missing key. It is more like the ruins of a palace after a fire, where fragments remain in different corners, each real, each damaged, each suggesting a shape that can never be rebuilt with complete certainty. Alexander dies in Babylon after a feverish decline. That much stands near the centre of the evidence. Around it gather the banquet, the pain, the possible cup, the hostile court, the ambitious generals, the exhausted body, the dangerous climate, the ancient poisons, the later accusations, the preserved corpse, the stolen burial, the broken empire, and the legends that grow wherever proof runs out. Poison, disease, and betrayal do not stand as simple rivals. They overlap, borrow strength from one another, and reveal different layers of the same event. Poison remains the most dramatic answer because it turns Alexander's death into a crime. It gives shape to anger. It gives the story a hidden hand. It explains why a man who survived so many open dangers could be destroyed in the private world of cups, servants, and trust. The court in Babylon is dangerous enough to make the idea plausible in atmosphere, if not proven in fact. Men have motives. Antipater's position is strained. His family becomes suspect in later tradition. Alexander's officers have futures that become much larger once he is gone. The Macedonian royal world has never been innocent of violence. In that sense, poison belongs to the political imagination of the age. It is not absurd. Yet poison struggles when pressed against the body. The illness lasts too long for the simplest version of a sudden deadly cup. The fever is too prominent in the tradition to be ignored. The famous details are often too vivid, too symbolic, or too convenient. A poison carried in a special container, administered through a royal cupbearer, timed perfectly before a succession crisis, and preserved as rumour through hostile politics may be true in some hidden way. But the surviving evidence cannot carry it to certainty. What survives in the record suggests suspicion more clearly than murder. Poison remains possible, but it floats in the dark water between motive and proof. Disease, by contrast, lacks theatrical beauty but fits much of the known world. Babylon is a plausible place for fever. Armies and courts are biological crossroads. Water, heat, crowding, insects, food, waste, travel, and exhaustion create conditions where infection can move silently and kill without permission from history. Typhoid fever, malaria, or another infectious illness could produce a slow decline. The medical case cannot be closed because the ancient symptoms are incomplete. But the broad pattern is strong enough that many cautious explanations begin there. Disease requires no elaborate conspiracy. It requires only that Alexander be human, and the hardest truth in the story may be that he was. Exhaustion gives disease deeper roots. Alexander is not simply a young man struck down without preparation. He is a man who has spent more than a decade forcing his body through violence and distance. He has old wounds, including severe trauma that may never have fully healed. He has endured brutal climates, irregular sleep, heavy drinking, emotional devastation after Hephaestion's death, and the immense strain of ruling an empire that cannot rest because he cannot rest. No single explanation fully accounts for this, because the final collapse may have been cumulative. A fever that might not kill one man may kill another already hollowed by years of command. A cup of wine may matter less as poison than as one more burden placed on a body near its limit. Betrayal is the most slippery answer because it may be true even if no one poisons him. The men around Alexander may not have caused the fever, but they quickly become involved in what the fever means. They manage access. They interpret gestures. They debate succession. They convert loyalty into claims. They protect the royal family when useful and later destroy it when necessary. The empire is betrayed not necessarily in the sick room, but in the aftermath. As companions who once rode under one king become rulers of divided worlds. Betrayal without a knife is harder to prove and easier to see. It lies in the transformation of shared conquest into private inheritance. This is why the mystery refuses to settle. Each answer explains one part and leaves another part restless. Poison explains suspicion but not clearly the fever. Disease explains the fever but not the political darkness. Exhaustion explains vulnerability but not the timing. Betrayal explains the aftermath but not necessarily the cause. The body points toward one set of possibilities. The court points toward another. The empire's collapse points backward, making every face around the bed look more dangerous than it may have seemed at the time. History, here, is not empty. It is crowded, but crowded with evidence that does not align into one final verdict. Alexander's age intensifies the uncertainty. At 32, almost 33, he's old enough to have conquered beyond any predecessor, but young enough that death feels like interruption rather than conclusion. Had he died at 70 after a long reign, disease would seem ordinary. Had he fallen in battle, legend would have accepted the battlefield as a fitting stage, but he dies in a palace after days of illness, while planning more conquest, with no clear successor ready. The manner of death feels out of proportion to the life. That disproportion is the opening through which mystery enters. The setting intensifies it further. Babylon is not a neutral place in memory. It is ancient, river-fed, priestly, imperial, and already layered with rise and fall. It has seen kings claim cosmic order and lose it. It stands between practical administration and symbolic weight. For Alexander to die there, in the heat of Mesopotamia, after warnings later remembered as omens, gives the story an atmosphere no bare diagnosis can erase. A fever in Babylon sounds different from a fever anywhere else. The city itself seems to participate, though cautious history must say that cities do not kill by symbolism. They kill, when they do, through heat, water, crowding, politics, and human imagination. The final tragedy is that Alexander's death reveals the incompleteness of his life's work. He conquers the Persian Empire but does not replace it with a stable system that can survive him intact. He experiments with cultural fusion but leaves resentment unresolved. He founds cities but does not live to see what they become. He plans Arabia while his body is failing. He gathers power so tightly into himself that when he disappears, everything must be renegotiated. His death is mysterious partly because his empire is unfinished. A completed system might have absorbed the loss. Alexander's world cannot absorb him. It can only break into pieces that continue carrying his name. Those pieces, in time, reshape history. The Hellenistic kingdoms that emerged from the wreckage spread Greek language, art, science, trade, military institutions, and royal forms across regions that Alexander once crossed at speed. Alexandria in Egypt becomes a centre of learning and memory. Seleucid power stretches across parts of Asia. Macedonian and Greek elites adapt to older Eastern traditions even as local cultures transform the conquerors in return. The empire dies, but the consequences continue. In that sense, Alexander's death does not end his historical force. It changes its form. The living commander becomes a dead origin story. And perhaps that is the final reason the mystery endures. Alexander is too large to be explained by one cause. Even in death, the fever belongs to medicine, the rumours belong to politics, the corpse belongs to religion and legitimacy, the succession belongs to military power, the legends belong to memory. Each field claims him, and none can fully possess him. To say he died of disease may be medically sensible, but it does not exhaust the event. To say he was poisoned may be dramatically satisfying, but it outruns the evidence. To say he was betrayed may capture the moral atmosphere, but not necessarily the biology. The truth may lie not in choosing one word, but in seeing how all three gather around the bed in Babylon poison as suspicion, disease as probability, betrayal as consequence. The image that remains is simple and immense. A young king lies in a hot palace room while the city murmurs beyond the walls. His generals wait, his soldiers fear, his physicians fail. The river moves through the dark. Somewhere in the distance, ships and armies are being prepared for a future that will never arrive. The body weakens, the empire listens, then breath stops, and the world Alexander made begins to divide itself among the living, more than 2,000 years later. The question still lingers because the evidence is broken, because power corrupted memory, and because some deaths do not become smaller with time. They become wider, until they are no longer only about how one man died, but about how ambition, mortality, and history meet in a room where even the greatest conqueror cannot command one more morning. The story softens after the last question is asked, because no answer can fully bring the room back. Babylon is gone as Alexander knew it. The palace walls have fallen into earth, the canals have shifted, dried, filled, or changed their courses. The men who waited around the bed became names in wars of succession, and statues, coins, fragments, and footnotes. The armies that once held their breath scattered into kingdoms. The royal child born after Alexander's death did not inherit the world. The body that became a prize vanished eventually into the deeper mystery of lost tombs and changing cities. Time took the witnesses, then the records, then many of the places themselves. What remains is the outline of a young man at the edge of silence, and around him the enormous shadow of everything unfinished. He had crossed mountains and deserts, broken armies, founded cities, and forced distant peoples into the same historical current. Yet the final boundary was not a river in India, not a fortress wall, not the army of another king. It was fever, weakness, breath, and the fragile machinery of the human body. Where the poison touched the cup, where the disease moved through water and heat, where the betrayal waited in the minds of men nearby, the ending still narrows to something deeply human. A body fails, a voice fades, the world continues. That's why the mystery does not need a perfect solution to remain powerful. Its uncertainty is part of its truth. Ancient history often reaches us like light through dust, bright in places, obscured in others. The closer one looks, the more one sees not only events, but absence-missing documents, lost testimonies, damaged motives, stories altered by fear, loyalty, pride, and grief. Alexander's death is one of those places where history admits its own limits. It can weigh possibilities. It can reject the weakest legends. It can follow the fever, the court, the body, and the empire. But it cannot stand beside the bed and see everything clearly. So the final image is not of conquest, but stillness. The Euphrates moves in the dark beyond Babylon. Warm air rests over the city. Soldiers wait for news they already fear. Generals begin to imagine a world they do not yet dare to name. In a guarded chamber, Alexander lies beyond command, beyond ambition, beyond the next campaign. The empire he made trembles, then loosens, then becomes memory. And somewhere beneath all the arguments, beneath poison, disease, and betrayal, there remains the quietest truth of all. Even the largest lives pass into silence, and history is what the living build around that silence after the breath is gone.